Chapter 1007 Dealing with the Aftermath on 160 Buckland Street. After watching Leonard fly out of the world of concealment with the word of the sea in one hand, Klein turned his attention back onto his surroundings. He first observed Winner and Nuni. He originally imagined that he couldn't use the marionette that had been parasitized by Amon, but to his surprise, he realized that he could control his spirit body threads again. Klein was first stunned before he came to a realization. When Snake of Fate Will Septon used Reboot to reverse Amon's condition in time, it also made the things he'd parasitize experience similar changes. Hence, Enuni had turned back into his marionette. As expected of the strongest power of a monster pathways sequence 1. Klein heaved a sigh of relief before allowing his figure to fade away from where he stood. He teleported back to his master bedroom, leaving a bunch of marionettes around to defend against any accidents. Right on the heels of that, Klein entered the bathroom and headed above the gray fog. He used Enuni's prayer light and began observing the entire street with the sea god scepter in hand. Without a doubt, his focus was on his residence and Unit 39. He found Butler Walter, Housekeeper Tanaja, Member of Parliament Mocked, Ma'am Rihanna, and many servants having remnant signs of being parasitized. They appeared somewhat in a daze. As for Hazel, she was on the brink of total collapse. Her hands were on the ground, having pushed herself backwards into the corner. Her back was leaning close to the wall as she huddled into a ball, trembling. Mocked and company had noticed something wrong with her. They surrounded her in concern, hoping to know why. However, Hazel would scream loudly whenever they attempted to approach her. She would resist violently, so all they could do was stand meters away, wearing a panicked and helpless look. During this process, they would, from time to time, nudge their glasses or pinch their eye sockets. This only served to leave Hazel even more horrified. She appeared to be on the brink of losing control. Klein felt horrified when he saw this scene above the gray fog. He imagined a scene: Daddy Amon, Mommy Amon, Maid Amon, Footman Amon were circling around Hazel, trying to soothe her nerves but were helpless. They wore the same expression and the same monocle with different clothes. Even if Hazel were to hold out and not lose control, she would definitely develop mental problems. At the very least, she would be in a half-crazy state. Klein's thoughts raced as he lowered the sea god scepter and returned to the real world. Buckland Street and the several streets remained enshrouded in darkness. It exuded a serene, tranquil, and profound feeling. This was a world that had already turned into a secret. Klein took down a hat, wore it on his head, and teleported to a director's office in 22 Phelps Street, Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. Audrey had already changed into a light green dress and was daydreaming with a fountain pen in hand, reminiscing over every detail of the punishment operation in the afternoon. Susie, on the other hand, had gone out for a stroll. Suddenly, this noble lady sensed something and looked up. A black-haired, brown-eyed, thin-faced figure with cut facial features was rapidly reflected in her emerald, limpid eyes. This figure wore a white shirt, black vest, black trousers, and black leather boots. He had a cold expression, his body was bent slightly as he held one hand over his top hat. Audrey was first taken aback before she recalled who this person was. Gairman Sparrow. Although she had never met him before, she had already seen his extremely lifelike picture on the papers and wanted posters. Klein realized that he hadn't changed back to Dwayne Dantes based on Miss Justice's reaction. However, he wasn't too mindful of that. He released his hand from his top hat and straightened his body. He said with a nod, "There's something that requires your help." His disguise had also been stolen by Amon. But after a reboot, it was returned to him. He just didn't have the time to change back into Dwayne Dantes. Mr. World, who's already a demigod, needs my help. He's in need of therapy because of some mental problem? No, it doesn't seem to be the case. Audrey pursed her lips as she put down her fountain pen in anticipation and curiosity. She stood up and gave a serious reply, "No problem." Klein didn't waste any time and walked over. Grabbing her by the arm, their figures faded away as they vanished from the spot. Instantaneously, they appeared outside the activity room at 39 Buckland Street. This is teleportation? Audrey's eyes turned slightly as she instinctively wanted to ask something. However, when she felt the heavy atmosphere and the screams, her face immediately wore a solemn look. "There's a patient?" she asked without much doubt. It's really easy to talk to a spectator. There's no need for much explanation. Klein tersely acknowledged and said, "Yes, she encountered a supernatural incident and suffered a terrible fright. She's on the brink of losing control. Do you have the means to not be seen by the people inside?" There was no need for him to say his last sentence, as a large-scale illusion was enough to resolve the problem. Furthermore, after receiving the blessings of concealment, ordinary people likely didn't retain much of their corresponding memories. However, after witnessing Adam's powers of invisibility, Klein was rather curious if Miss Justice had such skills at Sequence 6. Mr. World is feeling curious. That's really rare. He doesn't seem to be wearing a thick mask and has changed to a thinner one. He's a really good patient who heeds medical advice. Audrey's chin moved slightly as she nodded. Yes. As she spoke, she glanced at Gairman Sparrow, who reached out for the handle and pushed open the door after receiving her response. Member of Parliament mocked and Ma'am Rihanna completely ignored this beautiful girl as they discussed in a panic about hiring a doctor. As for Hazel, she remained curled in a corner, trembling vigorously like an abandoned baby animal. Miss Hazel, as a senior spectator, Audrey didn't have the problem of forgetting others. She observed Hazel's condition and frowned slightly. She turned her head and said to Gairman Sparrow, Mr. Sparrow, can you briefly explain what she encountered? Only with sufficient knowledge can I quickly resolve the problem." Klein was already prepared as he quickly and succinctly explained, "She's a beyonder of the Marauder pathway, a student of a demigod who had nefarious thoughts. Her teacher attracted blasphemer Amon's avatar and ended up getting herself killed. Her destiny and identity were stolen. As such, Amon infiltrated her family, parasitizing her parents and servants. Just now, while we were eliminating Amon's avatars, she realized that her parents and servants had all turned into Amon. She didn't know that was Amon, but she understood that it was a strange existence. If you have anything you wish to understand at a deeper level, things which do not involve the psychological treatment, you can always ask during the next gathering." Blasphemer Amon? Mr. World and company have eliminated Amon's avatar again. No avatars? Audrey was somewhat shocked as she instinctively glanced at Mocked and company. She couldn't imagine that they had once been parasitized by Amon and had turned into him. To have everyone parasitized. Audrey recalled Mr. World's words and felt more afraid the more she thought about it. She felt her entire body turn cold as she couldn't help but think of herself if she were in Hazel's shoes. This left her somewhat stifled as she subconsciously cast placate on herself. Is the supernatural world always this cruel and terrifying, or is it just occasionally? After calming down, Audrey muttered softly. She didn't wait for the World Gairman Sparrow's reply, because from what she had seen at the tarot gathering, she knew the answer very well, always. Looking back at Hazel, Audrey walked over, filled with pity. She crouched down and first used placate. Hazel looked up blankly and saw a perfect, flawless face, as well as that pair of emerald-like eyes. At that instant, she seemed to return to the ball of that previous night, having witnessed this lady descend like an angel. She instantly calmed down. She saw ripples rise up in that pair of limpid, green eyes. They were serene, calm, and deep. There's no need to be afraid. Calm down. Everything is already over. Audrey used hypnosis to directly communicate with Hazel's body of heart and mind. She heard hysterical screams and the horror that was taller than mountains and deeper than the ocean. Taking into account Hazel's condition and encounter, she quickly came up with a plan for treatment. She directly hypnotized Hazel and made her forget today's encounter and the existence of her teacher. She was only capable of vaguely remembering her identity as a Beyonder and other general knowledge. Hazel gradually calmed down before she slowly fell asleep. After you awaken, that terrifying experience will no longer exist, and I was never here. Audrey used a gentle voice to complete the last step of the hypnosis. Following that, she slowly got up and observed Hazel for a few seconds. She pursed her lips and whispered without turning her head, "I made her temporarily forget the corresponding memories, but that memory remains. It's just hidden deep down. In future gatherings, I'll continue treating her, guiding her to slowly remember and accept this memory. Only then can her mental problem be completely resolved. Otherwise, perhaps a familiar action or sentence will jolt her awake. She will then break down once again, and perhaps it will result in a direct loss of control." Miss Justice is becoming more and more professional. Klein sighed as he asked cautiously, "Then you will have to hypnotize all the people who were parasitized. They are not to show any hobbies that don't originally belong to them, like the wearing of monocles. Also, let them pray to the Evemite goddess after 15 minutes to obtain complete cleansing and purification." Audrey nodded with abnormal seriousness. "No problem." Klein immediately stood to the side, watching this noble lady cue everyone who had been parasitized in this house with the greatest feelings of pity. Chapter 1008. Splitting minutes later, Klein, with the face of Gehrman Sparrow, walked out of 39 Buckland Street with Miss Justice Audrey and headed for places where the other parasite victims were. After a few silent steps, Klein suddenly looked ahead and said, "It's not rare to see such matters happen among unaffiliated Beyonders. Without any suitable guidance, it often implies that they're constantly dancing at the edge of a cliff with the possibility of falling at any time." Audrey tersely acknowledged and said after a few seconds, "I know. Compared to before, I'm not as, she deliberated for a moment before breaking into a grimacing smile, as though she had found a suitable adjective she required to mock herself. "Naive. Phew." She then exhaled without hiding it as she looked ahead. "If I had known that the mysterious world was so cruel and terrifying last June, I might not have raised the request of becoming a Beyonder." Klein turned his head slightly and took a look at the noble lady's face. He asked in a seemingly casual manner, "If I were to give you the chance now to completely leave the mysterious world, would you accept it?" Audrey was taken aback as she slowly pursed her lips and said, "No." After giving such a response, she seemed to relax a little as she smiled and continued, "Under the premise of knowing how cruel and terrifying the mysterious world is, the me from last June would have given up being a Beyonder. But the me of this year wouldn't. This might be the price of growing up. I understand what you're getting at." Klein continued forward at the same pace as he said, "After those victims are completely purified, a number of them will spit out worms of time. They can be used to create fate siphon charms. It's a demigod-level item that can switch the fate between two parties for a short period of time. When the time comes, I'll give you one as payment for today's treatment." Audrey was about to decline it before she fell silent again. She then nodded gently and said, "Okay, /Wu11AW or LD. SITE." Just as she said that, she suddenly paused. She turned her head to glance at Gehrman Sparrow and smilingly said with a mixed expression, "I know why you just asked me that question." Klein chuckled without giving a direct answer. Audrey retracted her gaze and immediately felt a lot better. She asked as though they were having a chat, "I participated in the punishment operation at noon, and I dealt with the Amon aftermath in the afternoon. Today is really a tarot day." Her words were a double entendre as she said with utmost wistfulness. From her point of view, noon was a cooperative operation that involved 5 members, the moon, the star, judgment, justice, and the magician, with different levels of involvement. In the afternoon, the tarot clubs The World and Justice had involved themselves in the elimination of Amon's avatars in different ways. This was indeed a day to remember, and in a sense, it could be considered a tarot day. Klein nodded in agreement at Miss Justice's words, but he didn't tell her that the star Leonard had also been involved in the afternoon operation. Furthermore, he was the main force in the operation. Amon's avatar must have been difficult to deal with, right? Audrey finally found an opportunity to raise the question. She stared at Gehrman Sparrow, making no attempt to hide the curiosity in her green eyes. Klein smiled. If I had done it alone, you wouldn't be seeing Gehrman Sparrow, but Amon here instead. Having your destiny and identity stolen? Audrey asked in enlightenment. Klein tersely acknowledged. We'll discuss the specifics in the future. In short, to eliminate all of the Amon avatars in Backland this time, we had mobilized angels. If you were to encounter Amon's avatars in the future, never believe that you have the means to handle him alone. Immediately find an opportunity to seek help. Yes, his trait is the wearing of a monocle. He enjoys pulling off harrowing pranks. Angels were mobilized. I wonder if it was that death console or the angel from the fate domain, or... Audrey looked up at the sky and saw the clouds frozen in midair. They appeared like props under the dark background. Like an attentive student listening to a teacher, she seriously nodded and said, I will keep that in mind. The two continued walking, occasionally silent, occasionally breaking out into a conversation until they entered 160 Buckland Street. After a few minutes, inside the activity room of Hazel's house, Mocht and company suddenly had the strong urge to sit in their seats, raise their hands, and place their clasped hands before their mouth. They then began to piously pray and chant the Evernight goddess's honorific name. After an unknown period of time, they coughed in unison until their tears and snot flowed out. Cough. 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 Without realizing it, they separately coughed out worms with 12 translucent rings. The moment these worms fell to the ground, they vanished without garnering any notice. Similar things happened in other places of Buckland Street, but everything was quickly restored to normal. And the darkness had faded away at some point in time as the clouds began churning again from the sweeping winds. Amidst her parents' coughing, Hazel slowly regained consciousness. She was puzzled as to how she fell asleep on the sofa during high tea. She felt that she should have been in an excellent mood, but she just couldn't bring herself to smile. She felt as though there was a feeling of indescribable sadness and pain bearing over her heart. Upon seeing her parents' concerned gaze landing on her, not only wasn't she touched, she even felt a little fearful. She trembled like an introvert who wasn't accustomed to making contact with others. Hazel knew that this wasn't her personality, but she couldn't control herself. However, she didn't find it weird or puzzling as she continued enjoying the high tea pastries. Mocht and Rihanna felt the same. They had a nagging feeling that there was something hazy about their memories, but they just couldn't recall what. 160 Buckland Street. In the master bedroom which had its curtains drawn, a figure suddenly outlined itself across the coffee table. It was the barefooted Ariana, leader of the ascetics, matron of the Evernight cloister, head of the 13 archbishops of the Church of Evernight. She was wearing a Spartan robe with tree bark as her belt. In the lady's eyes, the grey sideburn Dwayne Dantes was about to leave the sofa. On the coffee table in front of him were 9 transparent ringed worms. Good afternoon, Ma'am Ariana, Klein said with a solemn bow. Thanks to your help, Amon's avatars in Backland have all been eliminated. You can choose a portion of these spoils of war. He had previously prepared a marionette beside every person who had been parasitized, and he used an illusion to bring these worms of time back. After hearing him, Ariana tapped her chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion and replied in a pious manner, "Praise the lady." She didn't decline the offer or stand on ceremony. She reached out her right hand, and 2 worms of time flew up and landed in her palm. Amon must have certain guesses about this. You still have to be careful in the future, Ariana said simply before her figure vanished inch by inch as though she had been erased. Watching this Archbishop leave, Klein sat down and picked up a pen and paper, writing to Leonard Mitchell. He wanted to ask what other effects the Worms of Time had other than creating fate siphon charms. He believed that he couldn't turn all the remaining Worms of Time into fate siphon charms, as it would be too monotonous. It made it easy to be countered, and it prevented him from handling different situations. Therefore, he had to consider other possible uses. With the Worm of Time as a vessel, he could use the powers stirred from other symbols, patterns, and labels that differed from the Fool. This would likely result in different effects from the fate siphon charm. And this was something Pallas Zoroast was an expert at. After writing his letter, Klein took out the adventurer's harmonica and blew at it. Rionette walked out of the void with the 4 blonde, red-eyed head in hand. The 8 eyes paused before looking at the remaining 7 Worms of Time on the coffee table. Miss Messenger looked at it for 3 full seconds before retracting her gaze. She then bit on the letter and gold coin which Klein handed over. Still 7 Pinster Street, Klein succinctly said. Rionette Tynker's remaining 3 heads replied, in the future, you can seek my help in such matters. The payment will be the spoils of war. Klein was taken aback as he said, all right. After Miss Messenger returned to the spirit world and vanished from his room, he frowned and muttered, since she can recognize the Worms of Time, it means that she knows that this battle might have escalated to the level of angels. She wasn't afraid at all. Miss Messenger is stronger than I imagined. 7 Pinster Street. Leonard received Klein's letter from Rionette Tynker's mouth. He still felt a hint of excitement as he eagerly unfolded the letter and read it. After the messenger left, he immediately asked with a suppressed voice, "Old man, there should be other ways to create charms, right?" Just now, Pallas Zoroast had given him 2 Worms of Time from Amon as today's reward for the risk he took. In Leonard's mind, the slightly aged voice replied with a smiling tone, "Of course, once I sleep for a while and digest what we received this time, I'll teach you. It wouldn't take too long. Also, do not go to Buckland Street any time soon." "Why?" Leonard asked in surprise. Pallas Zoroast chuckled and said, "All of Amon's avatars in Backland have been eliminated, and it is in no way a trivial matter. The number of people who can do that is just a handful. So, do you think he will have some guesses?" This. Leonard's nerves tensed up again. Pallas continued, "However, there's no need to be too worried. His true body wouldn't be able to enter Backland, and having recovered quite significantly, I don't have to be too worried about his avatars. In addition, I've found a piece of information from Flora Jacob from his memory fragments. Somewhere in Backland hides the treasure of the Jacob family. We shall wait until the end of the year for the gathering. There, we will seek out and cooperate with the other descendants of the Jacob family to excavate that treasure trove to share the items inside. When that happens, even if Amon gathers a large number of avatars, raising it to almost the level of a sequence 1, there's no way he can truly defeat me. To ensure balance, Dwayne Dantes can also be involved in it." Chapter 1009 Payment is always exacted for what's bestowed. Leonard immediately felt very relieved when he heard Old Man Pallas. He cast his attention back to the angel-level battle that happened in the afternoon and asked rather curiously, "Which Pathways angel does that giant serpent phantom belong to?" Pallas Zoroast fell silent for a moment before saying with a sigh, "Snake of Fate. The counselor of the Life School of Thought. A Sequence 1 angel. I never expected him to join them, counselor of the Life School of Thought. He has also become a blessed of Mr. Fool. The corresponding card is the Wheel of Fortune." Leonard's eyes widened as he realized that Mr. Fool's faction seemed comparable to the 7 Orthodox churches. It was truly unfathomable. Death Consul. Snake of Fate. Incomplete messenger. There are 3 angels under Mr. Fool. It's no wonder Klein was able to become a demigod so quickly. Just how long has it been, and I've already been embroiled in a battle at the angel level. It's really unimaginable how things will develop in the future. Leonard held the letter and sat on the sofa. He felt another sense of urgency towards digesting his Soul Assurer potion and advancing to Spirit Warlock. He had been busy placating the souls in the Backlund region recently, but due to the numerous missions, he was still far from completing them. He couldn't find an excuse or opportunity to visit Tingen City to steal the powers from that drop of the eternal blazing sun's blood. Furthermore, the arrival of Amon's avatars had been quicker than he had expected. South of the bridge, Rose Street, Harvest Church. Emlyn White, who had changed into a brown priest robe, stood in front of a long table with candle stands. He watched Ernst Boyar working hard at wiping the altar before he raised his right hand and casually pointed. To the side. Left side. That spot's dirty. Ernst Boyar, who also wore the clergyman attire of the Earth Mother, shot an angry look at Emlyn, but he still listened to his instructions and re-wiped the area he hadn't wiped seriously. I know you're very mad. It's how I felt when I learned that you deliberately hid key information from the ancient castle intel you sold me, Emlyn said with a smile, completely unfazed by his glare. Also, I forgot to inform you. I'm also a Viscount. It happened last week. Sanguine Viscounts corresponded to the Moon Pathways Sequence 5 Scarlet Scholar. The advancement ritual required the illumination of the full moon. Apart from that, one had to gather different metals, gems, and beyonder creature blood that represented the different moon phases. It was rather complicated. However, Emlyn had long obtained the promise from the sanguine upper echelons that a free advancement ritual would be held for him. He could advance easily once the full moon came. As for the digestion of potions professor, he had completed digesting it without putting too much effort into it. This was because he often taught commoners who were willing to learn at the Harvest Church to learn about herbs and medicine, and even combinations of some special potions. And apart from usually collecting dolls, researching history, and doing volunteer work at the cathedral, he loved thinking about the different potions and considering how they could be used in different battle situations. You're a Viscount? Ernst Boyar abruptly stood up straight as he wore a flabbergasted look. Among the sanguine, as they were all long-lived, they had quite a huge population. The number of beyonder characteristics was limited, so advancing was a very difficult endeavor. One had to be in a long line before they had the opportunity to advance. However, Emlyn White had only been a baron for half a year. Ernst remembered that it took him 6 years to go from baron to viscount. This was because his father had suffered an attack from artificial vampires. His passing left him the inheritance. Of course. Emlyn's smug smile grew obvious, but he remained restrained. I obtained a sequence 5 beyonder characteristics from artificial vampires. Ernst Boyar looked at Emlyn, momentarily at a loss for words. He felt that he had suffered a heavier blow than needing to do volunteer work at the Harvest Church. Your expression is rather interesting. Emlyn sked and said, perhaps one day, you'll have to address me as Lord when I become an Earl. Preposterous. What arrogance. Ernst blurted. I'm already very humble. I didn't mention I would become a duke or even a princeps. How am I to be the Sanguine's messiah without being an angel? Besides, in our tarot club, Mr. World has already advanced to become a demigod. Ma'am Hermit won't take much longer. This will definitely be a club filled with demigods. Emlyn chortled without arguing with Ernst like he usually would. He took on an attitude that whatever Ernst said was beneath him. Of course, he also understood that the advantage the Sanguine had after the Scarlet Scholar stage no longer existed. Becoming an Earl was in no way easier than an artificial vampire advancing to Shaman King. The digestion of the Scarlet Scholar potion is still relatively simple. All one needs to do is sincerely like the moon, worship the moon, and study the moon. This is what most sanguine do usually. However, the corresponding ritual is in the hands of the demigods. Without their approval, even if I were to obtain a shaman king beyonder characteristic from the sun, I won't be able to become an earl. Emlyn might be arrogant, but he knew very clearly what was required of him subsequently. There were two core powers of Scarlet Scholar. First, it was to create an environment that was advantageous to them. When the enemy wasn't good at spirituality or things related to the spirit world, they could create the effects of the full moon. On the contrary, they would also make the moon vanish if necessary. Second, it was to gain an instantaneous blink and a spectral form state under a certain area of the moon's illumination. Even if they were smashed to bits by an enemy, they could still reform themselves under the moonlight. And the strength of these powers was derived from one's comprehension and research of the moon domain as Scarlet Scholars. As for the strengthening of darkness-related spells, the enhancements of potion effects, and the resistance towards nightmare-like influences, they were just supplementary. Ernst was enraged by Emlyn's attitude. Just as he was about to speak again, he saw the mountain-like half-giant, Yutravsky, walk out from behind the cathedral. He hurriedly bent his back and bowed his head as he continued cleaning the altar. Emlyn White also picked up his cloth and the candle stand, wiping its surface with great proficiency. In the silent atmosphere, he thought of something. If he were to leave the Harvest Church now, would the upper echelons of the Sanguine force him to hand over the mystical items and supernatural props he obtained from Ernst? I really have no reason to reject their request, because some of the items don't belong to Ernst in the first place. Emlyn thought about it seriously and decided to return to the room later. He would set up a ritual and sacrifice the spoils of war he received to Mr. Fool. When the time came, he could split it with the other members like the Star and Justice. Oath of Rose cannot be sacrificed. It's only one part of the pair. Whoever obtains it will be discovered and identified by the wielder of the other ring. I'll just treat it as a spoil of war. I'll hand it over to Marquis Nibs tonight. I should be able to exchange it for some rewards. As for the rest, I won't participate in the splitting. Emlyn very quickly came up with a plan. As for whether the sanguine upper echelons would bear a grudge over this, he wasn't too worried. This was because he would also mention in passing about the cooperation that the Rose School of Thought's Temperance faction had requested while handing over the Oath of Rose. This matter had happened last week. He had planned on informing the sanguine upper echelon, but in the few mini-gatherings, the Hanged Man had advised him to do so after the punishment operation. It would accentuate his importance and mitigate any anger or resentment. Striking with a stick, and offering a carrot? At that moment in time, Emlyn suddenly had a deeper understanding of the suggestion. 160 Buckland Street. Inside Dwayne Dantes' bedroom. The spoils of war received are pretty good. A diamond brooch that can raise one's energy and maintain lucidity while resisting spells that act on the body of heart and mind. A paper figurine that can prevent any fatal damage and psychic piercing. A belt that can produce sun and lightning damage. A wallet that contains more than 300 pounds. After receiving the sacrifice and returning to the real world, Klein silently sighed as he sat in front of his study desk. He then took out a transparent maggot. Upon seeing this maggot, he felt his head ache, recalling the pain of having his soul body fracture. This was a worm of spirit that he had fractured from himself. It was to be made into the payment given to Snake of Fate Wuxia. He already had an idea on how to replicate the item which could briefly allow someone to restore their strength. It was to use the worm of spirit as a vessel and copy the complete symbol from before to garner a response from the mysterious space above the grey fog. For this, the outcome of his divination was that it would be rather successful. That item's true essence is actually one of the powers of the Seer Pathways Sequence 3, Scholar of Yore. To borrow a portion of one's power from one's past self. Responding with the Fool's identity would definitely work. The only problem is that the corresponding dimensionality, mystery, complexity, and danger of the symbols cannot be directly engraved on different metal plates. According to Wuxia, I have to use cogitation and draw on my spirituality to draw it on the worm of spirit. If it succeeds, I'll make myself one. I'll look at myself from the past and see if it will be Klein Moretti's childhood or myself hanging in the cocoon above the door of light. If it's the latter, it's best if I can confirm how long I've been hanging. Klein entered a cogitation state while in thought. Then, he kept constructing symbols with his mind, allowing his spirituality to repeat this process outside as it penetrated the worm of spirit. This was a complicated and difficult task. If he wasn't careful, it might lead to failure. As the invisible symbols fell and augmented the worm of spirit, Klein suddenly trembled. The worm of spirit ignited by itself and turned to ashes. Looking at his empty palm, Klein felt a headache. After a long period of silence, he silently muttered, "Life sure is difficult." Chapter 10:10 Consultant Fee. After rubbing his forehead, Klein was just about to split another worm of spirit when he suddenly saw Rionette in her dark, complicated-looking dress walk out of the void and stand beside the desk. In the mouth of one of Miss Messenger's heads was a neatly folded letter. "Who's it from?" Klein asked in passing. Rionette Tinker's remaining 3 heads replied, "The Mushroom King's Superior, Mushroom King?" Klein was stunned for a full 2 seconds before realizing that it could be Frank Lee. And Frank Lee's superior was Admiral of Stars, Katlia. The Mushroom King is Frank Lee? Klein asked in confirmation as he reached out to take the letter. With the 4 blonde, red-eyed heads' hair being held, they were made to bob up and down as though they were nodding. Miss Messenger even gives others nicknames. That's not right. Frank doesn't just specialize in mushrooms. His domains include cows, malt, fish, rose bishops. It's because Frank has had a breakthrough in his mushroom experiments, so Miss Messenger saw a boat full of mushrooms? Klein couldn't help but draw a breath as he hurriedly unfolded the letter. He was worried that the letter was Ma'am Hermit's plea for help. Of course, he wasn't too anxious because, at the most critical juncture, an experienced pirate like Admiral of Stars would definitely choose to pray to Mr. Fool. This letter did come from the future's captain, Katlia. On it were neatly written words. The Queen has already confirmed the time and place. Wednesday, 11 p.m., same place. I've no idea what you said to Frank Lee, but I can tell that he has been very excited recently. He has done many experiments with the artisan. He said that he would be able to produce another phase of results in 3 to 6 months' time. He also made it clear that if he were to obtain the Druid potion, he could save on making many intermediary objects and directly produce the final outcome. All I can say is that I wish you the best. I hope that everything will come to an end before the artisan completely breaks down. He has already begun regretting his faith in the primordial moon. Should I be happy that the securing of the City of Silver's food supply has progressed, or should I be worried about accidents? Klein rubbed his temples and decided to put the matter aside. After all, Ma'am Hermit, who was almost about to become a demigod, was watching Frank. If some unexpected development really happened, she would definitely seek help. Phew. Having finally confirmed his meeting with Queen Mystic, he heaved a sigh of relief and flicked his wrist, burning the letter in scarlet-red flames. After watching Miss Messenger leave, he continued splitting a worm of spirit when he suddenly frowned. He felt that the desk and the letter's ashes in the trash can were abnormally off-putting. Subconsciously, Klein got some tissue and wiped the desk before covering the trash can. After doing all of this, he looked at his dirted hands and stood up. He headed for the washroom and turned on the tap. As he washed his hands, he caught sight of the toilet beside him through the corner of his eye. He frowned bit by bit again. Today's cleaning wasn't done well enough, Klein softly muttered and suddenly sensed something wrong with him. Amidst his thoughts, his spiritual intuition quickly explained why he was feeling this way. This was a side effect of using Death Knell. As he had already become a demigod, allowing him to have a qualitative change in his spirit body and attain godhood, the corresponding negative effects had been reduced by more than 90%. The terrifying weakness of germophobia ended up becoming a trait of cleanliness OCD. Likewise, the period of weakness dropped from 6 hours to 1 hour. And the thirst that Death Knell gave him was no longer as obvious. Thankfully, Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he skillfully pulled out the toilet brush from the side. 11 in the evening, above the grey fog, due to Emlyn White's request, all the members who had involved themselves in the punishment operation, Justice, the Star, Judgment, the Magician, and the Hanged Man, appeared inside the ancient magnificent palace. These are all the spoils of war. Emlyn threw £3,000 that he had just sacrificed in the middle of the table and explained, one of the mystical items was Oath of Rose. It's a paired ring, allowing the wearers to be able to share their senses and thoughts with one another within a normal-sized city regardless of the distance. It's very valuable, but only one of the rings was acquired. It would spell danger for anyone who takes it. Therefore, I handed it over to the sanguine upper echelons and received £3,000 in return. He originally thought of keeping the £3,000 as his spoils of war, but he decided that it was better to sacrifice it and make it be one of the options. After a pause, Emlyn introduced the other items, listing their uses and negative side effects. He had even added more to the description. Knowledge stemmed from his penchant for sanguine history and some shared by Ernst Boyar under Father Yatravsky's watch. He is doing it with the intent of flaunting. Otherwise, with Mr. Moon's character, he wouldn't say so much. Oh, the reason for him being relaxed is due to Mr. Fool's absence. Audrey watched as a bystander without saying which item she wanted. Alger glanced at the spoils of war and said to Emlyn, "Have you met the sanguine upper echelons? Has the hunting of the key members of the Rose School of Thought been confirmed?" "Pretty much. I've also established contact with a member from the Temperance faction. However, he wishes to carry out the operation after September." Emlyn didn't hide the truth, believing that Mr. Hanged Man could provide useful pointers. Indeed, Alger nodded and asked, "It has to be after September?" This means that they are waiting for something that will drastically change the situation. Klein, who was waiting for the mini-gathering to end somewhere else in the ancient palace, suspected that it had something to do with Miss Sharon's advancement when he heard that. According to Miss Sharon, she should have been able to attempt the demigod ritual in July. Don't tell me that this ritual will last at least a month. If that's the case, it's quite different from the other pathways. Klein had a theory he wasn't too sure about. Possibly. Emlyn thought for a while before agreeing with Mr. Hanged Man's words. Following that, he surveyed the area and said with a smile, "You can begin choosing." Audrey had Mr. World's promised fate siphon charm, and Leonard had obtained the corresponding rewards from Old Man Palez. They appeared rather calm with the spoils of war, offered by the Sanguine Viscount. None of them rushed to speak as they politely waited for the others to go first. In addition, they had either experienced an angel-level battle in person or witnessed the horror brought about by Amon's avatars. Furthermore, they had confirmed that the Tarot Club contained potent forces, and they were suffering from some level of mental fatigue. Zio looked to her right before looking forward. Seeing everyone being so modest, she broke the silence. "I was involved in a very simple part of this and didn't take much of a risk. Furthermore, Mr. Moon has already paid £60 in advance. I'll just take the cash in the wallet." As she spoke, she took the handcrafted wallet, took out the cash, and counted it. £335. Emlyn surveyed the area and nodded when no one objected. "Okay." As for the handcrafted wallet, Zio threw it in the middle of the table and returned it to Mr. Moon to handle it himself. With Zio taking the lead, Furs said, "I only lent out Lamino's travels and didn't take on any risks. I'll take that moon paper figurine." Compared to the mystical items, such expendable Beyonder items were relatively lower in value. However, to the magician herself, she wouldn't have selected a mystical item even if she was qualified. This was because she could hire the corresponding member to record it if she needed a particular power of the mystical item. As for Moon Paper Figurine, an expendable item that could take a fatal blow and psychic piercing once, it couldn't be recorded. It was definitely the first choice for someone who feared for her life. After saying that, she waited for a moment. Only when no one objected did she take the Moon Paper Figurine. Emlyn then cast his gaze at Miss Justice. Leonard extended his hand and said with a smile, "Ladies first." Audrey didn't decline the offer as she swept her gaze across the items on the table. She pointed at the diamond brooch and said with a smile, "I'll take this." She had heard Mr. Moon mention that its name was Alcohol Nemesis. It kept the wearer brimming with energy with lucidity in their thoughts, giving them resistance to influences on the body of heart and mind. Thankfully, I had first used bribe charm to be safe, and with Ern still being in a half-conscious state after waking up from the dream, I wouldn't have been able to hypnotize him. This item is also useful to me. At the very least, it will give me another layer of protection when facing the higher-level members of the psychology alchemists. I don't have to worry about the negative effects if I don't always wear it. Audrey thought thankfully as she retracted her gaze from the diamond brooch in satisfaction. After the selection, Emlyn didn't give Leonard the chance to speak as he directly said, "This moon sash is yours." From his point of view, the moon sash was worth more than £5,000, something more valuable than the £3,000 in cash. Actually, I was leaning towards taking the £3,000. I have to buy the Word of the Sea, and the price is still £10,000 after Klein gave a discount. After spending that, I'll only have £650 in savings. Leonard ultimately didn't reject it as he nodded. Okay. Emlyn finished distributing the spoils of war and picked up the remaining £3,000 in cash. He then split a stack and pushed it to the side. "Mr. Hanged Man, this is your payment. £1,000. You should call it the consultation fee." Without Mr. Fool present, Furs was also a lot more relaxed. Alger didn't stand on ceremony as he nodded, reaching out to take the stack of cash. "The compensation for the carriage driver will also be borne by me." Emlyn surveyed the area in a rather good mood. 11 p.m. on Wednesday, at the south entrance of the Backlund Bridge. A figure quickly phased into existence in the night sky, with one hand on his hat and the other hand by his buttons. He had black hair, brown eyes, and sharp facial features. This strongest adventurer with the cold expression was none other than Gehrman Sparrow. Chapter 10:11 Roselle's other warning. It was late at night with the thick clouds concealing the moon. It was dark across the Backlund Bridge. Just as Klein teleported here, he saw green pea vines descend from the sky like a storm that enveloped his surroundings before he could look around. They intertwined and quickly formed a forest. They stacked upwards in layers, making it impossible to see its peak. Klein released his right hand's grip on his top hat and familiarly followed up the path paved by the vines. It didn't take long before he saw a naturally formed swing made out of green plants. He also saw Queen Mystic Bernadette who stood beside the swing. This eldest daughter of Emperor Roselle had a head of long chestnut hair. She wore a blouse with laced flowers that formed a bow tie. She matched it with a grey dress that went past her knees and a pair of Wellington leather boots. She also wore a bonnet with a hanging black fishnet. "You've grown faster than I had imagined." Bernadette's blue eyes behind the black fishnet reflected Gehrman Sparrow's figure. Klein replied without any change in expression, "Praise Mr. Fool." As he said that, he inwardly lampooned, "This is what it means to strive to be stronger, relying on oneself rather than on others." Queen Mystic nodded slightly as she said with a gentle but emotionless voice, "I know why you want to see me." Without waiting for Klein to say a word, she tilted her head slightly and looked at the vine swing beside her. She said in a tone as calm as a lake that had countless undercurrents beneath it, I feel that he hasn't really perished completely. Does that mean you believe that Emperor Roselle hasn't died completely? He lives somewhere in this world, with a chance for him to return? Klein didn't expect to hear such a straightforward and sensational words right at the beginning of their conversation. Although he easily controlled his expression, he was somewhat at a loss for a reply. At the same time, he noticed that Bernadette referred to Emperor Roselle as he instead of he. Regardless if they were using ancient Faisac to speak or the normal daily language used in Loan or Intis, they were completely different words. This means that deep down in Queen Mystic's heart, Emperor Roselle isn't an angel, but a father. Klein calmed down his emotions and deliberated before asking, "Why do you have such thoughts?" Bernadette retracted her gaze from the vine swing and said with the same gentle voice, "Towards the final stages of his life, although he was crazy and radical, everything he did had preparations in place. I believe that he must have prepared something for himself. You should know that he attempted to switch pathways in his later years and tried for the vacant Black Emperor throne. This required him to build 9 secret mausoleums in the form of pyramids. After he died in the White Maple Palace, the churches of the Eternal Blazing Sun and Steam jointly found 8 mausoleums and destroyed each one of them. However, the 9th mausoleum remains to be discovered. No one knows where it's hidden. If he had already become Black Emperor, he can definitely awaken inside that mausoleum. If he fails, I believe that there's a possibility of using it for his resurrection." Bernadette's voice softened as she spoke. Towards the end, her voice was ethereal and nearly indiscernible. "You aren't that confident either. It's mostly a kind of hope and expectation." Klein sighed. Suddenly, he recalled the words by King of the Five Seas Nast. Emperor Roselle liked to stand in front of a particular floor-to-ceiling window and look to the west. From Roselle's diary, Klein knew that he had discovered the abyss's entrance in the fog sea west of Intis. There, he had found a primitive island and believed that it was filled with oddities and was worth exploring. Could it be that Emperor Roselle built the last secret mausoleum in the abyss or on that primitive island? Klein thought for a moment before smiling. "You seem to understand the Black Emperor pathway very well." He suspected that Emperor Roselle had left the Black Emperor card as a bookmark and had used Bernadette's name in ancient Faisac as the activation incantation because he partially wanted to inform his daughter of the corresponding ritual. In the end, Bernadette had seemingly grasped the information via other means. The lips behind Queen Mystic's fishnet veil produced a slight curl. "I've already investigated this matter for more than a century. And to figure out the details, I've suffered the infusion of knowledge from the hidden sage. I can tell that you, and Mr. Fool who's backing you, have a deep understanding of this. I've always been curious why you're so interested in his matters. From the current situation, and in terms of seniority, you could call me uncle. The Emperor and I might very well be roommates who had been hung up for many years." Klein lampooned to relieve his emotional upheavals. However, he replied in a calm tone, "You can raise this question to Mr. Fool." He didn't plan on telling Bernadette that the 9th secret mausoleum might be somewhere in the fog sea, very likely to be on the primitive island, or in the abyss. It was more suitable for the Fool to answer the question. Queen Mystic wasn't surprised by Gehrman Sparrow's response. She cast her gaze west to a certain spot far away. Although he couldn't see Bernadette's gaze, Klein could vaguely sense that this lady was looking at the place where she had her childhood. She was looking at her spiritual home, the home where she could no longer return to. At that moment, in the green vines and deep darkness, there were a lot of subtle emotions and dreams that hid deep in the heart, fermenting. In just a matter of seconds, Queen Mystic retracted her gaze and gently said, "After my matters in Backlund ends, I'll pass a few pages to Katlia and get her to ask the question on my behalf." "Why don't you ask next week?" Klein didn't hide his puzzlement. Bernadette calmly replied, "I feel that the answer will affect my mood, and a bad mood will result in my failure." "A failure because of a bad mood? What sort of matter has such strict requirements?" A clash with a demigod of the mind domain? Or perhaps, after she resolves the knots in her heart, will she have the confidence to attempt to become an angel? Klein nodded in thought without pressing. This was a secret of hers, something that it was best not to ask about unless necessary. Queen Mystic then said, when he wrote those few diary pages, I was sitting opposite him. I wanted him to teach me how to interpret and write those symbols. He didn't agree to it and only ruffled my hair. Back then, I was already of age. I can tell that he was worried, apprehensive, and in a difficult position when he wrote those pages. Finally, he told me that if I can really become an important figure of the mysterious world as Zeradol predicted, I must make sure to remember, be careful of the spectator. Be careful of the spectator. Klein couldn't help but inwardly repeat Roselle's warning. He believed that the Emperor wouldn't be broadly referring to the beyonders of the spectator pathway. He was definitely pointing to a particular special existence, some special matter, or both. Emperor Roselle was a member of that ancient secret organization. That ancient secret organization's founder and leader is. Klein's eyelids twitched as he didn't dare to think any further, afraid that a particular existence would hear his thoughts. Perhaps there are detailed descriptions on that diary page, he said, hoping to see that diary page as soon as possible. I know. Bernadette nodded. She didn't continue on the topic. After 2 seconds of silence, she said, I should thank Mr. Fool and you on Catlia's behalf. Obtaining the blood of a snake of fate is very helpful towards her future. Although the advancement ritual of a mysticologist doesn't have any requirements on the mythical creature's pathway, the best choice is still the fate pathway. This will make it a lot easier for her when she advances to sequence 3. Why? Klein asked with the mindset of learning new knowledge. After all, it was impossible for a blessed to know everything. Even a true god was incapable of that. Bernadette's eyes turned slightly vacant. Another way to call prying into the secrets of fate is clairvoyance. The mystery prior's sequence 3 is called clairvoyant. This also why I'm in Backlund. Due to a particular future prediction? Klein mused, having a guess and some level of enlightenment, many pathways seem to have the ability of clairvoyance. The corners of Queen Mystic's mouth curled up slightly as she sighed and said, in ancient times, many Beyonder creatures believed that gathering similar powers would lead to a qualitative change and breakthrough, but all of them went mad without exception or lost control. Only after the first blasphemy slate appeared did all creatures realize that balance, the kind of balance needed to walk on the edge of a cliff, was key to the path of extraordinariness. Therefore, a domain's powers can be scattered across many pathways, concentrating on a few main pathways while the other pathways share the remnants. A negative example is the King of the North from Groselle's travels, you listen. Klein fell into a deep thought without pressing. After a while, Queen Mystic broke the silence. If you have nothing else, let's end it here today. Klein thought for a moment before saying, all right, if you need any help, you can find me through Admiral of Stars. Bernadette nodded gently as her figure suddenly turned transparent before turning into a cluster of bubbles. The bubbles scattered and flew off before vanishing immediately. The dark green pea vines retracted and vanished into the night. Klein seemed to be held by an invisible hand as he landed gently on the Backlund Bridge. He reached out his hand to press his top hat and surveyed his surroundings. There were rows of houses lining the banks, emitting faint yellow lights. Amidst the gushing sound of the surging river and the darkness of the night, everything appeared serene, silent, warm, and peaceful. I hope none of this will be destroyed. Klein sighed as his figure quickly turned transparent and faded away. Chapter 10-12 First day of September. Dear Mr. Azek, ever since September was ushered in, Backlund's temperature has been dropping day after day. Recently, the elderly can already be seen wearing gloves when outdoors. Just like last year, the smog has begun to envelop the city. This would happen 1 to 2 days a week, or even more. Clearly, the environmental measures governing air pollution aren't something that can be resolved in a year or two. It will take at least 5 years. Something that should be worth being happy about is that the pungent smell in the air has already lessened significantly. My sanguine friend is very pleased with such weather. Another delightful change is that more and more students, postmen, and technical workers have bought bikes. The number of carriages on the streets has decreased, implying that the smell of horse feces and the stench it brings is no longer the main pollutant in Backland's air. Of course, they still occupy a rather important position. As you know, those ladies and gentlemen who think highly of their standing wouldn't casually lower their own standards of one. However, based on my observations, their kids are gradually having a growing interest in bikes. I've been leading a normal life during this period of time. I go to St. Samuel Cathedral and the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation a few times a week, participating in their activities and continuously donating cash. I occasionally visit the turf club, watch plays and orchestras, or play cards or golf at the club. During weekends, I either participate in balls, banquets, or saloons. I forgot to mention that I've already bought a manor. It formerly belonged to Duke Negan and is called Mager. It has its own excellent vineyard and brewery, as well as a huge forest and plantation on it. It can be used for farming and hunting. Its main building has a huge rectangular shape with 4 stories. It has a large number of rooms, and a casual tour of the place without walking out the door would take me more than 10,000 steps. At the same time, it also has a large number of sculptures, oil paintings, decorations, and exquisite cutlery. It's simply palatial. Perhaps my description is a little exaggerated. After all, I've never seen a real palace. This is also the first manor that I own. I still remember my time in Tianjin. I lived in a rental apartment with only 2 bedrooms with my brother and sister. Every day, we slept to the smell of coal. This was introduced to me by Brigadier General Konas Kilgore. It cost me £20,000. You don't have to worry about my financial situation. I made a huge sum of money from the southern continent, and I also sold some mystical items. Currently, I still have more than £17,000 in cash and £15,000 worth of gold bars, including various gold coins, soli, and pence. I'm rather satisfied with Mager and have sent my former valet, Richardson, to be the land steward. It's now autumn, and I'm going to invite guests to enjoy a pleasant weekend there. I hope Richardson can make adequate preparations. The mysterious world in Backland hasn't changed for now. I hope it will continue like this. The magic mirror I previously mentioned to you has been restored to normal. However, it seems to still suffer from post-traumatic stress due to the damage Amon had dealt it. As long as I question it about what happened, it will automatically change the color of its text and give an erroneous answer and repeatedly request me to compliment it. It also has different views on leaving the Church of Steam. It seems to have decided to stay a little longer, believing that it would be safer that way. It has even thought of showcasing its danger and become a Grade 1 sealed artifact. I have to say that I'm always surprised with the way it thinks. Thanks to some of its answers, I've found a way to create pure darkness. It is to create it with a charm of the Evernight domain that has Dreamworld properties. It's considered a response of the Eve-Might goddess and is categorized under pure darkness. In addition, after repeated tests, I've finally figured out the way to carve the godhood symbols through cogitation and create the item I want. Upon writing this, Klein, who was sitting on the sofa while using his thigh as his table, stopped writing and rubbed his temples. Repeated failures implied the repeated loss of worms of spirit, and every separation was a damaging blow to his spirit body. It took him a long time to recover. Therefore, in order to have redundancies to prevent any accidents, Klein never pushed himself to the limit. After separating 3 or 4 worms of spirit, he would choose to rest for a few days before beginning the engraving process. Such breaks took him this long to master the method and create a finished product. Glancing at the rectangular diamond beside him, he saw layers of complicated symbols that extended into the void from the constantly refracting light. His head felt a little dizzy as though he was witnessing a part of history. I'll call it the yesterday once more charm. Klein retracted his gaze and continued writing. The coastal regions have had another storm brewing. The two houses of the kingdom have entered the traditional phase of debating over bills. With the footsteps of the new year approaching and getting louder, it makes me worried for some baffling reason. May you recover quickly and wake up soon. Your eternal student, Klein Moretti. Putting away the pen and folding the letter, Klein blew Azek's copper whistle and summoned the skeleton messenger that stood nearly 4 meters tall. Unlike before, this messenger had only shown its head and one arm. The rest were beneath the floorboards on the second floor. This made it appear significantly shorter than Klein. After all, I'm now barely considered a blessed of death. Klein handed the letter to the messenger as he watched it crumble into bones, gushing down into the ground like a waterfall. After doing this, he picked up the yesterday once more charm on the armrest. This was his first successful product, and he planned on using it first. After all, making it again was easy now that he had the experience. As for whether borrowing strength from his historical self posed any dangers, Klein had already performed a divination above the grey fog ahead of time. He believed that if it involved the real fool or the owner of the Door of Light, then he would have the mysterious space above the grey fog to block it for him. And the result of the divination was that it was very safe. After staring at the diamond-like charm for a few seconds, Klein no longer hesitated. He opened his mouth and said a single word in ancient Hermes, history. He had attempted it in the real world and not above the grey fog because he was worried that the mysterious world would sever the connection to the past. Amidst the echoing of the jarring word, Klein injected his spirituality into the yesterday once more charm. Light that appeared like scattered fur lit up, illuminating the surroundings with bright and pure light. Vaguely, a scene flashed past Klein's eyes. It was him dancing leisurely with Daily Simone beside Zangwill's corpse. It was the grey-sideburn and exceedingly handsome Dwayne Dantes. It was Gairman Sparrow pressing down on his top hat while landing on the black tulip thanks to the blessings of the wind. It was the Sherlock Moriarty who struggled during the descent of the meteor. It was Klein Moretti who summoned sunlight when he heard the baby's cry in the Blackthorn Security Company. It was the pale university graduate who raised the revolver and aimed it at his temple. Beyond this, all the scenes vanished. All that was left was the grayish-white fog. And only when the powers of the charm were exhausted did Klein find himself at the end of that fog. Indeed, my transmigration is related to the grey fog, that mysterious space, and that strange door of light. This basically verifies it. I was sleeping in a cocoon in the past, hanging above the door of light. I've no idea how long I was in that state. Compared to his first time seeing the door of light, Klein, who had made the confirmation, remained calm as though he had long expected it. Phew. Next, I'll make 2 yesterday once more charms for Will. This charm isn't of much use to me. I won't be visiting him this week. It will incur suspicion if I feed him ice cream every week. Their maid is already looking at me in an odd way. Also, since I've mastered the cogitation engraving method of the godhood symbol, I can bring forward the creation of the extraordinary bullets made with the worms of time. Yes, Leonard said that he will be visiting Tingen in the next few days. Let's see if the power of the mutated sun sacred emblem can be stolen. Klein rubbed his forehead and left the sofa. At a previous tarot gathering, Leonard had already informed him of the 4 types of godhood symbols and magical labels he learned from Palez Zoroast. They came from the Marauder domain, and it was said that one of them was capable of misdirecting the enemy, making them make errors in judgment. Another was to steal 3 Beyonder powers that the target had formerly used, beginning with the most recent power. The third would cause the enemy to lose plenty of vitality if the enemy could be affected by it, making them enter an aged state. Finally, one of them could create worms of time that didn't live long. They would secretly parasitize the target's body and allow the charm user to control them. Among the 7 remaining worms of time that Klein had, he had already made 3 into fate siphon charms and had given Miss Justice 1 and kept 2. This also meant that he still had 4 worms of time, allowing him to try out each of the 4 effects. Of course, his intuition told him that the chances of a successful product weren't guaranteed. As for Leonard's 2 worms of time, one had been made into a fate siphon charm. He had followed the World Gehrman Sparrow's instructions to pray to Mr. Fool and had received a reply. The other relied on Palaz Zorost's help to create a parasite charm. After busying himself with a series of tasks, it was evening. Klein had 5 successes and 1 failure. He obtained 2 yesterday once more charms, 1 parasite bullet, a deceit bullet, and a deprivation bullet. The only failure was the aging bullet, seemingly due to the inability to use sufficient powers from the mysterious space above the gray fog. Looking at the 3 similar-looking bullets that were a mix of transparency or translucency, Klein heaved a sigh of relief. He took out Death Knell and loaded the bullet. In the revolver were 3 of his control spirit bullets. After clearing the altar, he walked out of the room and headed for the 2nd floor. Upon entering the dining hall, he said to butler Walter, who was waiting for him, "Invite the guests to a hunting trip over the weekend in the city outskirts using the name list." "Yes, sir." Walter was already prepared for this, remaining stem and serious. Tingen City, 36 Zutland Street. Leonard got off the carriage as he looked at a newly built building with a mixed expression. He momentarily forgot to enter. Chapter 1013, Individual Growth. The 36 Zutland Street of the past was just filled with a cement foundation, with each floor's 2 windows forming the shape of an arch with their covers being shut. It had the architectural traits of post-1300s of the 5th epoch, and the natural lighting wasn't very good. After its reconstruction, the bottom floor had a small sheltered porch with 2 oriel windows that extended to the 2nd floor. The thinner portion of the window frames had a wall and a decorative column that supported a thin stone beam. Above the oriel window was a parapet that connected straight to the 3rd floor. This was a 3-story architectural style that had been made popular in recent years. His thoughts seemingly going adrift, Leonard had a feeling that he had come to the wrong place. After falling into a daze for about 10 seconds, he stepped into 36 Zutland Street with a silver inlaid cane. Following that, he walked up the stairs, turned around a bend, and saw the black door and vertical signboard, Blackthorn Security Company. When he arrived, he seemed to gradually find a sense of familiarity. He sped up his pace and pushed open the ajar door. A brown-haired girl who held the Tingen City Honest paper up vertically on the desk moved the papers to the side when she heard the unconcealed footsteps, revealing a smooth forehead, light brown eyes, and a pretty face. "Good afternoon, Roseanne," Leonard greeted somewhat hesitantly. Roseanne first wore a look of surprise before her expression fell. She said in an abnormally cold tone, "Good afternoon. Congratulations on avenging Captain and Klein." Leonard widened his mouth, at a loss for a response. He didn't even press down on his top hat despite his dislike of wearing hats. He forced a smile and nodded slightly. Then, he went forward in silence, passing Roseanne, planning to enter the door beyond the partition. Just as he was about to enter the office, he suddenly heard Roseanne say rather softly behind him, "Live well." Leonard slowed down his pace slightly before nodding his head heavily. When he entered the interior, he instantly saw Fry standing by the captain's office. This corpse collector still had a paleness that resulted from not being under the sun for a long while. He had black hair and blue eyes, a high nose bridge, and very thin lips. He had a cold and dark demeanor. Leonard solemnly looked at him for a few seconds before exhaling, trying hard to coolly smile. "Long time no see." "Good afternoon, long time no see." Fry pointed to the captain's office. "I've already received the telegram and know of your request. I'll get 2 team members to carry out the operation with you. Also, you need to fill in a sealed artifact request form." Slightly surprised, Leonard said with a smile, "You're the captain now. You aren't as silent as before." Leonard had actually finished digesting his Soul Assurer potion and could advance to sequence 5 Spirit Warlock, but to obtain the power of that drop of the eternal blazing sun's blood, he deliberately kept it a secret. He continued placating the souls around Backlund and finally, through his hard work, found an opportunity to come to Tingen. "Yes," Fry said with a gentle nod. "Actually, I don't like to speak much, but I have to do so as the captain." Leonard nodded slightly. "When did you become a captain? Why haven't I heard of it?" "Recently," Fry succinctly replied before giving an explanation. "Shortly after you left, I became a Sequence 8 gravedigger. I finally advanced to Spirit Medium last month. And it just so happened that the previous captain was transferred away." "That's fast." Before Leonard could finish his sentence, he had punched himself in the head. "Look at my memory. I forgot that Klein had already shared some experiences with everyone." He lowered his right hand and said to Fry with a smile, "In that case, you still have room and time to make further progress. Perhaps you might become a deacon." Fry shot a look at him and retracted his gaze. "I'll likely not choose to continue advancing." "Why?" Leonard took a few steps out and came to Fry's side, asking in puzzlement. Fry looked up at the ceiling and said in a calm and heavy voice, "I wish to stay here. Protecting this place, always." Leonard fell silent and didn't give a response. He observed his surroundings and felt that there were quite significant changes, but there were also many things that remained immutable. Fry fell silent for a while before saying, "I'll dispatch 2 members to follow you." As he spoke, he headed for the basement. Leonard then subconsciously followed by the side. The office right at the bottom had its door open. A few Nighthawks were in there playing cards, fighting evil. When they sensed their captain approaching, they hurriedly put down their poker cards and stood up. Leonard swept his gaze across them and saw 2 familiar faces. They were Royale, with her smooth black hair, and the white-haired, black-eyed Sika. At the same time, he also saw a few unfamiliar faces. He saw the pence, soli, and poker cards on the table. For a moment, he felt his mind adrift as his vision blurred up. In the Rorstad archipelago waters, in a small harbor neighboring a fishing village, at the bottom of the future. Frank Lee rolled up his sleeves and crossed his arms, seriously looking at the mushroom in front of him. The mushroom, together with its cap, stood at a height of 1.8 meters tall. Its white surface had a few bright red spots that resembled eyes, a nose, and a mouth. Apart from that, its stem had protruding spores. They had thick and strong-looking white hyphae that resembled tentacles. Frank sized up this gigantic mushroom and surveyed the area, looking at the wooden walls, floorboards, and the mushrooms of different shapes and sizes before saying to Artisan Sealf, "Not bad. This experiment has made progress again. This mushroom has a strong inclination to reproduce, and this will make it hungry, making it eager to replenish itself with monster flesh and blood. Be it roasting or boiling, these can cease its activity, making it not as dangerous." How does it taste? Didn't you try it? The offspring that it produces have random flavors, beef, fish, and malt. Some are even filled with milk. One of them is enough to satisfy any requirements for breakfast. See, the crew no longer enjoy drinking anymore. There are mushrooms that can be plucked everywhere. I believe that when out in the wilderness, to fill one's stomach, one has to carry dry rations and hunt wild beasts. That's just too troublesome. If we can let our bodies grow mushrooms, wouldn't it save the hassle? Artisan Sealf was a lot thinner than back when he was in Biome. His eye sockets were deep and his eyes vacant. They were lacking in life. Upon hearing Frank's words, he seemed to recall something as his body trembled. He silently crouched down and opened his mouth, producing retching noises. "Are you okay? I know it was tough on you. I'm really grateful for all you've done recently," Frank said sincerely to the artisan. If it wasn't for you, the mushrooms wouldn't have such a strong inclination towards reproduction. Also, they have obtained abnormally strong vitality under the moonlight, allowing themselves to purify themselves. This effectively eliminated the poison that accumulates from devouring monsters. The only problem is that there's no moonlight in pure darkness. This is the next problem that we need to resolve. Xiaofan didn't say a word. After he finished vomiting, he immediately stood up and turned to rush outside. However, a thick and strong white Haifa reached out and pulled him back. Return my mystical items to me. I want to die with these mushrooms, he yelled frantically, his voice softening as his mouth was covered. At this moment, green vines rapidly retreated from a certain spot of the fishing village, as though it was growing in reverse. Katlia walked out of it, her eyes dark purple with some silver hints to them. Her ears continued resounding with the illusory ravings of the hidden sage, however, she no longer found it terrifying. She didn't find it unacceptable like before. Wherever she looked, there were countless indescribable figures looking as if they were shadows stacked upon each other, like an invisible gaze that was cast over from an unknown location. Compared to the past, she could already see the unknown existence hidden behind the curtains. She could see the moons high up in the sky that were of different colors. They were either blood red, silver, dark brown, or ghostly blue, resembling eyes that looked down upon the land. Katlia's mind hummed as she hurriedly retracted her gaze, afraid to look further. She had already dissected the snake of fate's blood and completed the ritual. Through that, she had obtained godhood, becoming a sequence 4 mysticologist of the mystery prior pathway. However, she remembered the Queen's warning: among all the sequence 4 beyonders of the 22 pathways, mysticologist was the job that encountered danger the easiest. It was because they often saw things that they shouldn't see, hear things they shouldn't hear, and be aware of secrets they shouldn't be aware of. Therefore, a mysticologist needed to know how to curb their curiosity and control their respective actions in order to live long. Removing the heavy glasses she hung on her clothes, Katlia wore it, but all the various things she saw in the real world didn't vanish. She curled her lips in satisfaction in a self-deprecating manner. She knew that the item could no longer seal her ability of prying into secrets. She closed her eyes before opening them. Her eyes had turned black, no longer having the mysterious dark purple and silver hues. Phew! Katlia heaved a sigh of relief and slowly walked to the future as though she had simply gone out for a stroll. She didn't wish to announce her becoming a demigod, and she had no intention of quickly becoming the 5th royal over the seas. To her, this was a trump card in this dangerous world, one that she had to keep close to her chest. South of the bridge, Rose Street. The carriage that Emlyn was on drove down the street when he saw the blurry figure in a white shirt and black vest with slightly messy hair appear opposite him. It was that wraith-like young man. "Long time no see, Mr. Merrick," Emlyn said with an unsurprised smile. Merrick nodded slightly. "I'm here to tell you that we've already made the preparations. We can discuss the actual operation." 1014 The growing group. "All right," Emlyn replied very calmly. Marie didn't speak further as his figure vanished. He knew that it was impossible to come up with a specific plan in an instant. Emlyn White had to first seek the opinion of the upper echelons of the Sanguine, therefore, he didn't stay. "This might be a chance for me to obtain godhood and become an earl." Emlyn smiled as he watched the wraith, Marie, leave silently. He had yet to digest the Scarlet Scholar Beyonder characteristic. The so-called opportunity to become an earl referred to the promise of obtaining a free ritual and the corresponding potion formula. The carriage continued forward and stopped at the entrance of the Harvest Church. Emlyn looked at the grayish-white fog in the sky with a look of satisfaction, pressed down on his silk top hat, and unhurriedly alighted the carriage before entering the cathedral's door. After changing into his brown priest robe, he picked up a cloth and a pail of water and began seriously wiping the surface of the candle stands. After Father Yatravsky, who appeared taller, finished his morning sermon, Emlyn stopped working and grumbled, why was Ernst allowed to return? He only requested to do a month of volunteer work. Father Yatravsky wasn't annoyed by Emlyn's repeated question from time to time, appearing extremely patient. Upon thinking of his encounter, Emlyn immediately felt indignant. He couldn't help but mumble, he was forced to do volunteer work, not out of his own accord. He can't be allowed to decide on the period. He needs to serve at least half a year. Father Yatravsky replied with a smile, he did well. He worked hard the entire month, guiding the devotees and copying the Bible. I could clearly sense that he had already realized the value of life and the joy of the harvest. Emlyn's facial muscles twitched slightly. Is he also, is he soon going to become a believer of Earth Mother? No, I didn't force him to change his faith, Father Yatravsky said gently. I only taught him the teachings of Earth Mother and to sense the traces and fragments that life brings. I hope that he will recall the home for the soul, the mother's embrace, whenever he feels lost. Emlyn's lips quivered, but he ultimately didn't say a word. He lowered his head and continued wiping. In an apartment in Sherwood Borough. Furs sat on a high-back chair, her gaze focused on an empty glass bottle on the desk in front of her. She had finally digested the astrologer potion some time ago. Today, under Zio's watch, she had concocted the Asmon's brain and the ancient wraith's cursed item into the scribe potion. She mustered her courage and drank it. At this moment, she felt her brain rapidly expanding. The grand folds and white matter rapidly increased as her body gradually blurred, separating into individual cells. Those cells formed a haloed door that circled her brain. Furs subtly heard the familiar ravings, but they were indistinct and blurry, preventing her from identifying the exact words at all. To the experienced her, it didn't affect her in any way. After an unknown period of time, Furs finally regained control over her brain and cells and could sense her body's existence. Almost at the same time, a large amount of knowledge resonated in her mind, making her understand how to use the powers of a scribe. The mutated brain reproduced the beyonder powers used by the target before driving a portion of the vitalized cells to form corresponding symbols, patterns, and labels for complete storage. This was, I came, I saw, I record, which used one's soul as a pen and one's spirit body as the paper. At present, I can only record one beyonder power that has the influence of godhood. The higher the target sequence, the higher the chances of my failure. Even targeted at sequence 4, one might not be able to succeed even once in 10 attempts. I can record 8 sequence 5 and 6 beyonder powers, and the effects are half of the original. I can record 20 sequence 7 to sequence 9 beyonder powers with their effects being almost like the original. When the potion is digested further, I'll enjoy an enhancement in all these aspects. Furs concluded the knowledge and her experiences before silently muttering to herself. This appeared to overlap with Lamino's travels, but Furs felt that no one would ever find having too many beyonder powers being excessive. Besides, the two were complementary. After all, she could rent Lamino's travels to other Tarot Club members and be paid with beyonder powers. However, she was unable to rent herself out. At sequence 6, an apprentice finally has sufficient combat strength. Furs reigned in her thoughts as she sighed to Zio. She then took a pen and paper and began writing a letter. Dear teacher, I'm very pleased to inform you that I've finally become a scribe. I'm just one step away from my dreams of traveling. After writing a few sentences, she saw Zio stand up and walk towards the door from the corner of her eye. She hurriedly shouted at her, "Hey, shouldn't we head to a restaurant to celebrate?" Zio replied in a stern manner, "Your overflowing spirituality is rather serious. You'll need several days of cogitation to keep it under control. You aren't allowed to smoke or drink. Don't overly indulge yourself in your emotions." After the advice, she added, I still have commissions to do. I almost have enough to exchange for the judge formula. All right. Furs threw up her hands. After leaving the house, Xiao unlocked the chains and got onto a bicycle specially created for youths. She then rode towards Hillston Borough. According to the intelligence she had previously obtained, Viscount Stratford had reserved lunch at a luxurious restaurant. Upon reaching the restaurant, Xiao secured the bike to a street lamp and found a secluded corner to observe the people passing by. After an unknown period of time, a carriage drove through the thin fog. There was a coat of arms with a flower and 2 rings engraved on it. Xiao's focus intensified as she watched the carriage stop at the restaurant's entrance. She then saw the grizzled Viscount Stratford, who was in his 40s, get off first. He then extended his hand to the passenger behind him like a gentleman. It was a lady draped in a dark red cloak. Xiao couldn't see the lady's face and only noticed that the lady's jaw was soft and her skin fair. On the Blue Avenger at the northern Sonia Sea. Alger Wilson's feet left the ground as he floated behind the window of the captain's cabin. He stared at the deck and distant waves outside. Having already digested a portion of the ocean songster potion, he had reported to the Church of Storms 2 weeks ago and had accumulated enough contribution points to obtain a wind-blessed potion and successfully consumed it. This also meant that he was officially a sequence 6. Of course, he had to redigest the wind-blessed potion, but that wasn't too difficult. The biggest problem is that the commotion created from digesting the ocean songster is too obvious. I should have bought that Word of the Sea and blamed the singing on it every time. Alger sighed silently, but he didn't feel too much regret. This was because even if he wanted to buy it back then, he didn't have the money for it. Furthermore, he had figured out the way to digest the ocean songster potion. I should be able to get the information soon and confirm who that Faceac Navy officer that Mr. Fool wishes to investigate is. Alger retracted his gaze and floated back to the desk where there was a brass sextant. At this moment, 2 sailors passed by the deck while belching. There seem to be sirens in these waters. I always hear their singing at night, one of the sailors said in uncertainty. His companion sneered. How is that possible? How can a siren sound so bad? It must be some noise produced by some sea monster. City of Silver, in the training field which wasn't as crowded compared to during daytime. A pile of blue ice was stacked there like a small mountain. Derek didn't bring his weapon with him as he stood empty-handed in front of the mountain of ice, piously praying, the fool that doesn't belong to this era. After chanting the honorific name and making his request, he looked at the chief of the 6-member council, Colin Iliad, walk towards the ice blocks from afar. Colin, with 2 swords on his back, carried a bottle of light-emitting and hot golden liquid. He watched as Derek exerted his strength to enter the ice block and bury himself inside completely without leaving a single crack. A deep and hazy darkness descended. Even with the lightning streaking across the sky, it was unable to illuminate the interior. In the blink of an eye, an indescribable surge appeared as though pairs of eyes were cast over from the depths of the darkness. Colin Iliad could clearly sense that Derek was in a deep slumber. Even though Derek was being frozen in ice that normally didn't melt and his body was trembling, he didn't wake up. Without any hesitation, he threw the potion bottle ahead of him. A wraith-like transparent figure floated above and enveloped it. This figure passed through the blue ice and came to the cramped space where Derek was. It took out the potion and placed it by Derek's mouth. Just as this action was done, it immediately retreated and left the ice blocks. Whoosh! Colin Iliad suddenly drew his sword and cleaved behind him to his right. A monster, whose rotting body was covered in eyes, burst out into yellow pus. It wasn't known where it came from. At this moment, Colin saw a radiant light emerge from the pile of blue ice. They scattered pure light, with a burning intensity, warmth, brightness, and vitality that was different from the surrounding lightning. This filled Colin's eyes as if the light had come from the Dark Ages. This city of Silver Chief watched intently and was motionless for a long time until another monster emerged from the darkness. In the ancient palace above the fog. Little Sun is at sequence 5-2. Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he cast his eyes at the crimson star representing the sun and cast it to another star. That signified Miss Justice. Over the past month or so, she had completed many of the Psychology Alchemist's missions and had exchanged her contribution for the Dreamwalker's potion formula. This also meant that she was about to meet Vin Rambus again. 1015 March of War Backlund, at the residence of the furniture merchant, Hamprez. Audrey once again met the counselor of the Psychology Alchemists, Vin Rambus. This old gentleman remained warm and elegant, his white but lush hair was neatly combed. His blue, deep eyes seemed to contain infinite knowledge. Upon seeing him, Audrey's eyes wore a vacant look before she came to a realization. It was as though she had finally awoken from a long dream and recovered her lost memories. She wasn't surprised or puzzled by this at all, accepting this fact without any resistance as if it was something very normal. "Good afternoon, Mr. Rambus," Audrey greeted with the etiquette that was flawless. Rambus nodded slightly and replied with a smile, "Good afternoon, our girl." Over the past month or so, he had gradually adopted the idea that she was the pride of the Psychology Alchemists and the most important girl. Audrey glanced at the diamond brooch at her chest and sat down with a smile, waiting for Vin Rambus to speak. In regard to the cue and guidance, she hadn't been affected at all due to her preparations. At that moment, when she heard Vin Rambus call her that, she wished to ignore everything, etiquette or whatnot, rolling her eyes without being afraid of being exposed. However, she ultimately held back without exposing any problems. Vin Rambus looked at Audrey for a few seconds before saying with the same smile, "You've done well during this period of time. As a reward, we've decided to give you the potion formula for Dreamwalker." As he spoke, he took out a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket and placed it on the coffee table. He then pushed it towards the noble lady. Audrey pressed down on her skirt and got up slightly. She picked up the piece of paper and unfolded it in front of Vin Rambus. Her gaze first fell on the main ingredients before she quickly skimmed the ritual. Main ingredients: 1 Dreamcatcher's heart, 1 Mind Illusion crystal or a mature mind dragon's complete brain. Ritual: seek out a harpy in the spirit world and sign a contract with it. Then, holding 1 tail feather, consume the potion amidst intense feelings of either joy or anger. As though sensing Audrey's puzzlement, Vin Rambus explained with a smile, "A harpy has the ability to give nightmares. It can snap people awake from their dreams, so the entire ritual's essence is to be immersed in a dream and be unwilling to wake up from it. Get pulled out of the dream via an external force, or else you might sleep forever or lose control and turn into a monster." Audrey nodded in thought. The requirement to consume the potion amidst intense feelings is to prevent myself from sleeping too soundly and deeply? Yes, you've already grasped the crux of the matter, Vin Rambus said with a smile. If you don't know much about the spirit world and can't find a harpy, we can provide some help. If the ritual's essence is for me to wake up from a dream, that means that the harpy isn't necessary. The blessings of Mr. Fool's angel can allow me to remain lucid in dreams. I can wake up whenever I want. Audrey's green eyes darted about and said with looks of anticipation, "I can try it myself first." Alright, Vin didn't mind the girl's desire to take risks. He paused and said, "I have another matter for you. If you do it well, we will provide you with all the ingredients of the Dreamwalker potion." "What is it?" Audrey asked without any resistance, just like before. Vin Rambus said with a slightly solemn expression, "Find out the attitudes of your father, Earl Hall, the present Duke Negan, Admiral Emirius, and the other nobles about a relatively major war." War, Audrey repeated the word that she had often heard but found somewhat unfamiliar. She had a vague feeling that ripples had suddenly formed under the surface of a seemingly calm lake. War. Above the grey fog, Klein listened to Miss Justice's prayer and fell into deep thought. He was unable to determine whether the psychology alchemists, Hermes, or maybe even Adam, who was lurking behind them, welcomed or objected to a war. As for whether the lone king, the prime minister, and a number of nobles and the members of parliaments wanted war, the answer was relatively clear. Last year, the hanged man had once asked Miss Justice a similar question. Her answer was that the king and prime minister had the tendencies of being warmongers, but they had chosen to first focus on internal reforms and settle the connections over various matters. Now, about a year had passed, and all the policies that had been implemented were on track. In other words, it was time to start a war to snatch back the interests which Lone had lost in East Balam. It's a revolutionary era. The strife between countries are intense, and once war begins, it's unlikely that it can be controlled. Furthermore, Adam, Amon, and the other kings of angels have appeared one after another, have already retrieved key items, or are seeking breakthroughs. A storm is about to descend on the mysterious world, and danger is lurking. Klein sighed and returned to the real world. The next day, he first went to St. Samuel Cathedral to pray according to his schedule and donated tens of pounds. Following that, he went to 22 Phelps Street, planning to participate in some of the business of the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. The moment he stepped inside, Klein saw Miss Audrey Hall and a few of the foundation staff coming down the stairs and walking towards the door. This noble lady was dressed very simply today. Her hair was tied up into a simple bun, and she wore no other accessories. Her dress was light green in color, and her sleeves had a circle of frills. There were no laces or tassels. "Good morning, Miss Audrey." Klein took off his hat as usual and bowed. He then nodded at the staff and greeted them. After Audrey responded, Klein casually asked, "Where are you going?" He knew that Miss Justice's main role in the foundation was to seek donations from the various ladies and gentlemen in high society. Audrey replied with a faint smile, "Visit the various universities and show some concern to the students we helped previously." Having said that, she blinked her eyes as her smile widened. "Mr. Dantes, do you want to go together? Take a look at the children who had the chance of changing their fates due to your ideas and kindness. Oh, some of them are already young adults." Although Klein had never thought of obtaining anything in return from the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation, he truly wished that these actions could help the target group. Therefore, he was rather concerned about the progress and the actual situation. He nodded with a smile after some hesitation. "I have no way of rejecting such an invitation." The group went out the door, and under Miss Audrey's suggestion, they chose an untracked public carriage. After getting into the carriage, Klein, in a gentlemanly-like manner, let Miss Audrey sit down first. Then, he sat opposite her and asked with a smile, "You seem to be very used to it?" Audrey looked at the foundation staff beside her and said with a smile, "It's not the first time. It's impossible for us to take my own carriage every time we head out. They have to use public transportation." Upon saying that, she blushed in embarrassment and said, "The first time I was on a public carriage, I took out notes with £1 face value. The lady who collected the money got me to buy a few copies of newspapers before going back to her. Oh, it's cleaner than I imagined. The smell of the air isn't that unbearable either." Klein nodded slightly and said, "This is because the truly poor are unable to take public transport like this. They'd rather walk. Under normal circumstances, they don't have to head out, nor do they go somewhere too far. Mr. Dantes, you seem to be familiar with such matters?" Although Audrey had guessed the reason, she still asked in front of others. Klein smiled. "Although I've never experienced it directly, I've seen too much of it." Audrey didn't continue on the topic. Instead, she mentioned to the beneficiaries that they were visiting to confirm their education and living conditions. Amidst their idle chat, they arrived at their first destination, Backlund University of Technology. Based on Audrey's identity and Dwayne Dantes' social relations, they met the chancellor of the newly established university directly. He was a resident of 100 Buckland Street, Mr. Portland Moment. This elder had a large build, a ruddy complexion, and a loud voice. Whenever he talked to his neighbor, Dwayne Dantes, and the distinguished Miss Audrey about the university's establishment, he would complain about the Higher Education Commission from time to time. Audrey and Klein listened with a decent smile and occasionally echoed his words. Finally, they found an opportunity to raise the need to begin work. Portland was just about to get his secretary when he suddenly heard someone knock on his office door. "Please come in," the chancellor said loudly. The door opened without a sound. A black-haired, brown-eyed girl entered. She didn't doll herself up and was rather thin. She had nice facial features, and she looked to be 17 or 18. Klein's gaze suddenly deepened before he reined it in. The girl hadn't expected the chancellor's office to have guests. In her anxiety, she hurriedly lowered her head and said, "I'm sorry." "It's fine." They were about to leave anyway, Portland said without minding it. "Have you finished the item I got you to make last week, Fies?" The girl walked through the door and stood to the side. Portland Moment then smiled at Dwayne Dantes and Audrey. "Her name is Melissa Moretti. She's very talented with machinery. I happened to chance upon her and got her to help in my laboratory. Of course, she can only do some miscellaneous chores for now." "Not bad." The corners of Klein's mouth curled up as he commended her with an obvious smile. Audrey glanced at him and smiled. There are always arrogant people who say that women have no talent in machinery, and this lady has proven them wrong. Portland laughed and shook his head. "There's no need to bother about such comments. All right, I'll get my secretary to help you in understanding the conditions of those beneficiaries." Audrey and Klein didn't stay any longer as they left the office. Once they were out the door, Audrey stole a glance at Dwayne Dantes, but she didn't say a word. 1016 News from the Numinous Episcopate 160 Buckland Street, inside Dwayne Dantes' mansion. Klein stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching as the rain began to descend along with the wind. The rain hit the ground and the glass, intersecting to form a mesh. Ever since autumn, Buckland had started to rain again. It brought with it a lingering coldness and humidity. Klein stood there motionless for a long time, watching silently into the distance through the blurry rainy scene, his eyes unfocused. Only when his spiritual perception was triggered did he stop his wandering thoughts and turned his head to the side. Rionette, with the 4 blonde, red-eyed heads in her hand, had a letter as she walked out of the void. "Who is it from this time?" Klein asked Miss Messenger out of habit. The last letter he received came from Sharon. The lady had told him that she had successfully completed the ritual and advanced to sequence 4 puppet of the prisoner pathway. Klein first sincerely congratulated her and apologetically informed her that he had already obtained what he needed and didn't need to visit Calderon City in the spirit world anytime soon. Of course, he also indicated that there was a huge secret there that might have something to do with him. He would probably head there one day, and when that time came, if Miss Sharon had the time or was willing, he wished to obtain her support. For Klein, on the one hand, he might have to head there to find the future ingredients he needed for his advancement. On the other hand, he believed that the magical city that involved ancient death, Phoenix ancestor Greg Race, also might contain the method to heal Mr. Azek's incomplete spirit bodies. Even if this death consul didn't have the means to advance, he hoped that by doing so, the former didn't need to repeatedly suffer the torment of losing his memories. Of course, Klein had prepared a plan for that. It was to wait until he advanced to sequence 3 Scholar of Yore. He could prepare more yesterday once more charms for Mr. Azek, or he could imbue him with the corresponding Beyonder powers to speed up the recovery of his memories each time. At that moment, Klein had already received a letter. Rionette Tinker's 4 heads replied one after another, from that undying idiot, Patrick Bryan of the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction. Klein easily understood who Miss Messenger was referring to. This was because Patrick was the one who wrote the most to him over the past 2 months. He reported almost anything of slight importance and asked for instructions. After a few times, Rionette Tinker gave him a nickname. Miss Messenger never showed interest in such matters before. I wonder when it began. Most of the people who write to me have been given nicknames except Miss Sharon. As Klein silently mumbled, he unfurled the letter and gave it a quick scan. In the letter, Patrick Bryan said that the Southern Continent's orders were no longer about getting him to make various attempts to awaken death. Instead, they got him to prepare a special ritual and help the Death Domain Angel inside the mausoleum, artificial death faction's leader, Hater, recover. It was to allow him to have the means to temporarily leave the land in which he'd sealed himself. Such an order didn't seem problematic on the surface, but it was a little sudden. However, Klein still sensed something amiss. The artificial death faction of the Numinous Episcopate in the Southern Continent had previously made Patrick continue the strange but dangerous rituals to awaken death. I managed to trick them by instructing him to use excuses such as the inability to gather the materials or the ultimate failure of the experiment. Now, they've finally suspected that there's something wrong with Patrick? Klein nodded in thought. He suspected that this was a test directed at Patrick Bryan, a test that pointed towards an angel. An angel's response to rituals covered the entire world. Yes, it's good as long as they don't suspect there's a problem with artificial death. After all, they've inherited a huge inheritance from the ancient Balaam Empire. Who knows if they have a way to affect the goddess's progress in controlling the death pathway's uniqueness. It could be a bane for both sides. Klein analyzed for a moment before heaving a sigh of relief. As for the test by the Death Domain Angel, he didn't think much of it. This was because the Fool could also direct power at the same level. With Angel's embrace, a disruption effect could be made. As long as the high priest named Hater didn't descend in person and only exerted influence remotely, he could carry out misdirections in an ingenious manner. After figuring this out, Klein flicked his wrist, igniting Patrick Bryan's letter with scarlet flames. As he returned to his desk, he took out a pen and paper and wrote, "You may proceed according to your teacher's instructions, but before the actual ritual, you must report this to me and gain my permission." As the interval between the receiving and sending of letters were short, Patrick Bryan likely remained in his original spot. Klein didn't summon Patrick's messenger and instead blew the adventurer's harmonica and handed the folded letter to Rionette Tinker. Amidst the drizzle, Zio draped a simple raincoat lined with tree sap over her and hid in the shadows, staring at the side door of Viscount Stratford's residence. It wasn't even evening, but the street lamps were already lit up. They emitted a faint glow in the rain. After a while, a rental carriage drove over from afar and stopped in front of the side door in a remote area. The Viscount's valet that had been hiding immediately ran out, opening an umbrella. He sheltered the cloaked woman down the carriage and quickly passed through the side door. As for the rental carriage, it remained in its spot without leaving. It had apparently been paid a sufficient amount of money. Zio still failed to see the woman's appearance, but she wasn't disheartened by it. She patiently waited in the cold rain as though she had turned into a motionless statue. She planned on attempting to tail the woman once she came out to confirm her identity. This was both an opportunity for her to obtain the judged potion formula, and it was also the reason why she came to Backlund, to investigate the truth of her father's death. And it was because she was spurred by such motives that Zio had persisted in monitoring Viscount Stratford to this day. MI9's other intelligence officers had already ended the mission due to the lack of any developments over the previous few months. Even the golden-masked man who had designated the mission hadn't asked about this in weeks. Clearly, he didn't place any importance on it. Inside Viscount Stratford's bedroom, a beautiful brown-haired girl wore a silk gown and sat in front of a dressing table. She was fiddling with the skincare and makeup products as if she had discovered a treasure trove. Viscount Stratford, who was already middle-aged, wore a male nightgown and walked to the beautiful girl with his hair still moist. He smiled at her reflection in the mirror and said, "Charmaine, you no longer need those to add to your beauty. It's just a type of female instinct." The young girl named Charmaine raised her hand with a smile, pressing down on the Viscount's palm that had been placed on her shoulder. Viscount Stratford smiled gently and said, "When you touch them, you have a pure and innocent air to you. Heh heh, you make me discover my youth, like the days when I was only 18. Without waiting for Charmaine's reply, he continued, "My wife had already passed away for years. I always imagined I would live until the Lord beckons for me, but who knew that I would meet you? In a while, when the pressure accumulated in Backlund is relieved, I will find a chance to walk down the wedding aisle to the altar with you." "Wedding? You want to marry me?" Charmaine was taken aback as she asked in disbelief. Viscount Stratford smiled and said, "Meeting you is a gift from the Lord. Although you aren't of noble birth, I've already married once. I don't have to consider such matters anymore. Of course, I'll think of means to raise your standing in society. Yes, I'll first find a merchant to recognize you as his illegitimate daughter." He droned on about his plan until he saw Charmaine's eyes filled with tears in the mirror's reflection. "The most precious thing about you is that you treat me 10 times better than how well I treat you, and you don't hide it." Viscount Stratford smiled as he lowered his head and kissed the top of Charmaine's head. Charmaine opened her mouth, seemingly crying and laughing. Only when the drizzle stopped and night fell did Xiao finally wait for the woman in a dark red cloak walk out and board the carriage. After memorizing the carriage's traits, Xiao tailed it from afar, using her beyond her powers as a sheriff and the empty streets at night to follow the target simply by walking or running. She went all the way from Empress Borough to the Backlund Bridge area. Even with her stamina, she was almost at her limit, but thankfully, the carriage finally came to a stop. Xiao brightened up as she switched her target from the carriage to the cloaked woman and continued tailing her. During this process, she was surprised that the woman had very good anti-tracking abilities. She would occasionally take detours and pause using obstacles. However, this didn't stump Xiao, since she was already an experienced sheriff. She patiently tailed from afar without coming too close. Just as she sensed that the woman wasn't too far from her final destination and that she was finally about to catch up to her, she suddenly caught the scent of a sweet, ethereal fragrance. Xiao's mind went into a daze amidst the fragrance before she completely lost track of her target. As for the fragrance, it had vanished as though it had never appeared. Xiao's pupils widened slightly. She didn't dare to search her surroundings for any traces. Inside a rental apartment, Trissy, with a gentle and sweet face that made one unable to resist looking at her, looked at the mirror reflecting Charmaine and said, "You seem to be in a good mood. How was it? This final mission isn't too unacceptable, right? Once you complete it, you can leave Backlund and start your own life." Charmaine was taken aback as her expression turned complicated as though she was disheartened. It was as though she had suddenly snapped out of her dreams. She didn't turn her head as her lips quivered while replying, "He said that he wishes to marry me." Trissy immediately pricked up her brows. "You mustn't believe a man's words during those times. You and I should know this very well. If he really wishes to marry you, he wouldn't be wary of you. He will wish to have a child with you." "Heh heh, did he do so?" Upon hearing her question, Charmaine's mood turned sullen. Trissy stood up and said with a smile, "I'm not stopping you from pursuing your love. If you wish to turn this temporary mission into a permanent one, you should think about what needs to be done." After ethereally finishing her sentence, she walked to the door and left the rented apartment. While heading down the staircase, Trissy suddenly noticed her shoes. She chuckled and said in a seemingly self-deprecating manner, "Love." 1017 Mager Manor, Backlund, Empress Borough, in the outskirts towards the northwest. This was a place that needed more than an hour via horse carriage. Mager Manor was built by the side of the Tussock River, so it had beautiful scenery around it with flourishing vegetation within its confines. Strangely enough, Backland's city areas had perennial rain with relatively few sunny days. However, in the outskirts, the clouds tended to be thin, and the sun was always bright. Despite the short distance, the two places had completely different weather. It was most obvious within the northwestern outskirts. It was even a rather famous grape plantation in the northern continent. And by following the Tussock River from this region northwest for another 50 kilometers, one would again encounter weather similar to Backland's city area. Such situations left meteorologists puzzled. They couldn't find any suitable theories to explain the reason. However, Klein had a vague guess. In the Fourth Epoch, this was the capital of the Tudor Trunsoist United Empire. It was also here that Blood Emperor Alista abandoned his humanity and became a crazy deity. Therefore, it was normal that the weather and terrain had changed forever in those very small confines. Leonard Mitchell had once mentioned information about this during one of the free exchanges. Furthermore, as an area with a long history and signs of early human activity, this Land of Hope buried countless ancient ruins. It was very possible that they could have an influence on the weather. The carriage drove into Mager Manor, passing by the fountain pond and small garden that was surrounded by the main building. Finally, it stopped outside the main door. Just as Klein got off the carriage with butler Walter, he saw the land steward, Richardson, lead 2 rows of male and female servants by the door, awaiting their employer. Compared to 160 Buckland Street, there were more servants here, but they were mainly lower-class servants. Looking at Richardson wearing a spanking new suit, Klein nodded with a smile. Well done. Without waiting for Richardson to reply, he took off his hat and handed it along with his cane to his valet, Enuni, while asking, "Have you prepared the activity room for the ladies to chat and for men to play cards in?" "Yes, sir." Yves placed poker cards, tarot cards, and some board games. The piano, violins and other common musical instruments have also been moved inside, Richardson answered eloquently. Klein passed through the door and nodded. Where's the smoking room for the gentlemen? Like the ladies, it's all on the second floor. They're separated by 5 rooms. Richardson didn't need the servants in the manor to remind him. He didn't even need to recall to give an answer. To ensure that his employer's first hunting excursion was flawless, he had taken note of every nitty-gritty detail. Although it exhausted him physically, he was excited mentally. Klein asked about dinner and the guest rooms and confirmed that everything was in place. Before long, he received the first batch of guests after Mager Manor had a change of name, now known as Dante's Manor. Member of Parliament Mocht and his family. "This place is much bigger than my Moose Manor." Mocht took off his coat with a smile and handed it to a servant while praising, "I've always heard of Mager's wine being of excellent quality, but I've never had the chance of tasting it. I can finally have my curiosity satisfied today. I hope you won't be disappointed." Klein smiled modestly. As a famous area for grape plantations in the northern continent, champagne, red wine, and white wine were considered the finest in Backland's northwestern outskirts. But with the manor here mainly owned by the nobles, self-brewed alcoholic beverages were typically not sold to the public. Therefore, it was almost unheard of. Only people from high society or those related to them would know of this. Mager was one of the most iconic manors. The wine that it brewed was widely praised by people in the know. Red wine of certain years was even offered at more than £100 a bottle by collectors. However, for Klein to be able to buy this manor for £20,000, he naturally had to agree to certain conditions. All the wine from certain years were to be taken away by Duke Negan's servants. Mocht was rather clear about this and didn't expect to drink famous wine commodities. He said with a laugh, "You can open a few bottles and pour a small glass of each for me. Let me decide which of the remaining wine is most spectacular." As a member of high society, he had never tasted the wine of Mager Manor. The reason was simple: he was a member of the new party, and the previous owner, Duke Negan, was the main sponsor of the Conservative Party. No problem, Klein immediately agreed as his gaze swept across Hazel's face. Compared to July and August, this girl had clearly cheered up. She no longer felt apprehensive when facing strangers. Previously, it was as bad as not willing to participate in any banquets or balls. This made those familiar with her think she was sick. And this was all thanks to Audrey. Whenever she met Dwayne Dantes at the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation, she had mentioned that she had recently met Miss Hazel Mock twice. Such communication didn't seem problematic at first glance since Hazel was a common acquaintance of Audrey and Dantes. Finding a topic about a common friend was common in idle chatter. However, Klein could read Miss Justice's hints and understood that she had met Hazel twice at different balls and banquets and had treated her twice. After getting Mock's family settled in, Klein welcomed the second batch of guests for the weekend hunting trip, Brigadier General Konas Kilgore, who had come with a friend that he had previously mentioned. Klein knew this friend, but he didn't know Dwayne Dantes. He was a steam car mogul, from his cage. He was one of the main investors of the bicycle project. He had relied on a lawyer suspected to be a beyonder with the lawyer sequence and had bought the 10% shares from Sherlock Moriarty at a cheap price. Since he's related to a lawyer, it can be explained how he's an Earl of the Fallen's friend. Klein went forward with a smile and hugged Brigadier General Konas and from his cage. "Welcome." He then stepped back and said to the portly, light blue-eyed Frommiz, who was a quarter-face-ack, "I heard your steam car is very famous. Why didn't you drive it over?" Before Frommiz could answer, the manly Konas Kilgore said with a smile, "No, you don't understand him. He will never give up the chance to showcase his steam car. However, the car's too heavy. On the way here, it fell into a ditch and couldn't be pulled out. Thankfully, I never believed his claims and rode on a carriage myself, following behind him. Otherwise, he would have had to cover the remaining distance on foot. The main problem is that our roads are terrible. They need to be renovated and rebuilt. They need metal tracks to be paved, just like steam locomotives." Frommiz retorted and threw his hands up. "I was planning on seeking some investments from you." We can talk about it later. You were the one who invested in us previously, but now you're asking me for an investment." Only then did Klein realize that he was a rather famous tycoon in the upper class of the kingdom. He had donated shares worth more than £10,000 and had purchased an expensive manor. He had also established connections with the military, so it was obvious he was rich. "But in fact, my current net worth is only 50 to 60,000 gold pounds, perhaps a tenth of Miss Justice's wealth. I wonder when I can really become a tycoon with a net worth of £1 million. Klein thought in a self-deprecating manner. After some thought, he said, "It's fine. I'm very interested in the fusion of machinery and steam. When I'm free, I can take a look at your steam car." "Spectacular," Frommiz immediately said with a smile. "If I didn't know that you had donated a large sum to the Church of Evernight, I might even think of you as a believer of the god of steam. I've drawn the triangular sacred emblem on my chest in the past after all." Klein didn't continue on this topic, afraid that Konas would discover his intentions. He pointed to the staircase and said, "Why don't you head to the smoking room to try some of the prized cigar collections here? It wasn't until I bought this manor that I learned that there was a room specially for storing cigars. Its temperature and humidity are maintained, but as you know, I can smoke, but I don't like it." "Not bad. Do you have chieftain?" Konas Kilgore's face suffused a smile. "Of course." Klein gave a positive answer. There was only one goal in organizing this hunting trip. It was to hunt this Brigadier General, Deputy Director of MI9. Therefore, he had taken into consideration all his preferences. However, Klein wasn't in a hurry to take action for this hunting trip. This was because he still lacked an understanding of Kona's Kilgore's actual strength as a hidden demigod. He needed more gatherings and hunts to figure out his preferences, level of alertness, and the items he brought with him. As a magician, Klein didn't perform unprepared. In an apartment in Sherwood Borough, Furs put down the book in her hand and looked at Zio, who was pacing around the activity room. She couldn't help but ask, "What are you troubled about?" Zio shot her a glance and said, "I'm frustrated over whether to inform MI9 about Viscount Stratford's close relationship with an unknown woman, or to keep it from them until there's further development." "Why are you keeping it from them?" Furs first asked in return before giving her answer. "Viscount Stratford is related to your father's death, but you normally lack the opportunity or strength to confront him, afraid of being exposed and affecting your mother and brother. And now, he might encounter an accident because of that unknown woman. He's in a relatively easy-to-deal-with state. This is your opportunity, so you're being hesitant, right?" Zio fell silent for a moment before saying, "Yes." Furs closed the book, stared at her friend, and said in a serious manner, "Since you're hesitating, it means you're already inclined towards one option." Zio slowly nodded and said, "Yes." Furs fondled her slightly long curly hair and stood up, extending her right hand, and said, "I already know your decision." "Well, do you need help?" Seeing Zio hesitant to give an answer, she laughed and said, "I'm a Sequence 6 Beyonder." Without waiting for Zio to answer, she looked around. "If you're worried, we can still seek additional help." She was implying that they could get help from the members of the Tarot Club. Zio thought about it and exhaled. "Not for now. Let's try it first. Let's head out now and continue monitoring Viscount Stratford." "Now?" Furs was taken aback. "All right. But before that, let me use the crystal ball to do some astromancy to confirm the level of danger." After some work, she held the pure crystal ball in one hand and said, "There's a certain level of danger." 1018 Unexpected Empress Borough, by the side of Viscount Stratford's mansion. Furs and Zio, who were dressed in black dresses, hid in a dark corner. They stared intently at the tightly closed metal gates as they patiently waited for their target to appear. It wasn't raining tonight, so they didn't have to face harsh weather conditions. The carriage that remained parked by the side of the street lamps made it clear to them that their patience would be rewarded. It was only a matter of time. After an unknown period of time, the gates produced a heavy metal groan as they slowly opened. A figure in a black cloak appeared with its head bowed. The figure walked to the side of the carriage and nimbly boarded the carriage. "Is that her?" Furs lowered her voice and asked Zio. She didn't have Beyonder powers that could restore a target's characteristics from a mere description, and she had never seen her before. Therefore, she couldn't rely on her spiritual intuition or astromancy to make a judgment. Zio nodded in affirmation and said, "Yes." As they quietly conversed, the rental carriage sped up and left the side gates. Zio immediately left her hiding spot, prepared to use her sheriff's Beyonder powers and the physical enhancement that being an interrogator gave her to lock onto her target while jogging. "What are you doing?" At that moment, Furs pressed down on her shoulder, foiling her plans. "Track her." Zio looked back at her friend in puzzlement. Furs looked at the rental carriage that hadn't completely pulled away from them and asked thoughtfully, "Why are you tracking her for? Also, didn't you say that the target has a rather powerful Beyonder protecting her once you enter the Backlund Bridge area?" "That's right." Zio first answered the second question before saying, "Your question is very odd. The reason you track someone is to determine the target's appearance, identity, and motives." Furs retracted her left hand from Zio's shoulder and revealed a smile. "Since the target is protected by a rather powerful Beyonder, it will be difficult for us to complete the tracking in the Backlund Bridge area. We won't be able to find her residence and figure out her true identity. Do you wish to directly fight her guardian? Although you have me to help, are you certain about that person's strength? How certain are you? Will it be very dangerous? Besides, once the battle begins, it will definitely alarm the target. This is the same as stopping the carriage midway and confronting her directly. It will foil your primary objective. It will alarm Viscount Stratford and prevent him from falling into a predicament that will offer you a chance to take action. If we do it, then there's a possibility of failure, but failure is certain if we do nothing. Xiao emphasized that she knew the situation well. All she wanted was to make an attempt and find an opportunity midway. At this moment, the rental carriage had already turned into another street at the end of the road. Furs watched the back of it gradually disappear as she shook her head and smiled. No, no, no. We need to change our way of thinking. We should first attempt to figure out the target's appearance. After daybreak, we can use her appearance to perform normal investigations in the Backlund Bridge area and then obtain information from other channels. Your choice of words is very professional, Xiao said in thought. Of course. I've written detective novels before. Furs answered without any sense of modesty. But how do I figure out what the target looks like without alerting her? Xiao raised the most critical question. Prepared, Furs took out Layman's Travels and said with a smile, elementary. Using the psychological invisibility Miss Justice recorded. Although Audrey didn't encounter any situations that required her to use Layman's Travels, she had rented it thrice out of curiosity. She studied the uses and traits of the Beyonder powers recorded, and she recorded her own Beyonder powers into it. This included the rather useful psychological invisibility. As for her true identity, Xiao and Furs were increasingly certain of it, but they didn't directly ask or do any further investigations. That was the most basic form of respect towards other Tarot Club members. After hearing her friend's answer, Xiao came to a realization and was instantly inspired. Furs continued, by using the Beyonder powers on this page, you will be placed in the sensory blind spots of all surrounding creatures. They wouldn't be able to see you even if you were to jump around in front of them. That way, you can directly board the carriage and stand in front of the target, openly taking in her appearance and remember all her traits. Heh, I sometimes think that people who use psychological invisibility might end up being squashed to death by huge creatures that happen to walk past if they're unlucky. Don't make too much noise later. Don't speak to any nearby creatures, or else you will garner attention. Let psychological invisibility be dispelled automatically. Yeah. Xiao nodded, then she raised another issue. How do I prevent the target from discovering the sudden opening of the carriage door while it's driving? Without waiting for Furz's reply, she immediately pressed, did you record the door opening Beyonder power? Guess? Furs smiled as she handed Layman's Travels to her friend, telling her which pages psychological invisibility and door opening were on. With this in mind, Xiao immediately ran amidst the shadows, chasing after the rental carriage. Before long, she saw her target. Her right hand immediately trembled as she made the bronze-green notebook reveal a yellowish-brown goatskin page. She slid her fingers gently, and Xiao seemed to see countless rippling light appear on the surface of a deep lake spread outwards. When her vision returned to normal, she sped up and rushed to the side of the carriage. To ensure nothing went wrong, Xiao didn't immediately take action. With a few wide strides, she overtook the horse. She then turned around as though she was crossing the road. However, the carriage driver didn't notice her, nor did he shout out to her or rein in the horse. After confirming the effects of psychological invisibility, she sped up and dodged the horse's galloping and came to the side of the carriage. After a brief observation, she flipped through Layman's Travels and revealed a white page covered with strange patterns and symbols. Then, she reached out her right hand and pressed it on the surface of the carriage. Her figure instantly turned transparent as she appeared inside. The woman in a black cloak was sitting diagonally opposite her as if she was in thought, staring at the glass window where Xiao stood. However, she didn't notice the bounty hunter who had suddenly infiltrated. At such a close distance, even with her cloak lowered, Xiao was able to see her face clearly. Furthermore, the woman wasn't as careful as she was while walking outside. Her every action appeared rather casual as the hood was only at her eyes. Instantly, her appearance was reflected in Xiao's eyes, overlapping with a face that still had some male characteristics. This was a beyonder power of a sheriff. Xiao's eyes widened as she couldn't help but shout, "Sherman." She could foresee that the woman who often entered Viscount Stratford's residence was rather beautiful, but she never expected the woman to be her friend, Sherman. He was once a young man. A man who wasn't considered androgynous now looked beautiful. He had the charm of a woman. At that moment, Xiao couldn't help but size up Sherman. She couldn't associate her figure with the young man she used to know with each other. If it wasn't for her sheriff beyonder powers that allowed her to confirm that the person opposite her was Sherman, Xiao definitely would have imagined that she had made a mistake. And even so, she still suspected whether the person wasn't Sherman and was instead Sherman's twin sister. Upon hearing the surprised question, Sherman realized that there was another person in the carriage at some point in time, someone familiar. Bounty hunter, Xiao Derry Cha. Having already changed her name to Shermaine, she was first alarmed, but the words Trissy often mentioned instinctively appeared in her mind. You cannot meet people you used to know. Do you want your husband, your beloved, to know of your former state? Only by completely severing your connections can you be reborn, doing so in order to save yourself. Such words quickly flashed across Shermaine's mind as a terrifying thought emerged in her thoughts: kill her. This thought seemed to come from a demon in the abyss as it constantly whispered in Shermaine's ear as it resonated in her heart. Kill her. Kill this person who recognized you. Only by doing so can you truly escape the past and not lose the present. Kill her. Shermaine didn't answer Xiao's question. Her left hand slowly clenched up while slightly trembling. Xiao sensed the intense emotions running through the person opposite her and confirmed that it was Sherman. Immediately, she asked in concern, "How did you become like this? Where have you been all this time? Did you encounter something? Were you hurt?" Shermaine's lips quivered as her left fist relaxed a little. She said with a sobbing tone, "I've already begun a new life. Don't disturb me again, all right? I don't want to lose everything I have now. I don't want to see people that I knew in the past." The more she spoke, the faster it became. It became obvious that it was a plea. Xiao was taken aback for a few seconds before staring at Sherman. Pursing her lips, she said, "Okay." She didn't stay any longer and reached out to open the carriage window and jumped out. Shermaine silently watched this entire process and finally exhaled before she slumped into her seat like she had lost all her strength. It wasn't easy for her to control the demon in her heart. At this moment, she saw a figure rapidly outline itself out of thin air beside her. The figure wore a black, old-fashioned dress, but it didn't diminish her beauty and disposition. She sat there silently without a word, but it was impossible to not look at her. "Demoness Trissy. Why didn't you kill her?" Trissy asked with a smile, not revealing any gloominess. It was as like an idle chat where she would ask what she had drunk the previous night. "She's one of the few people who didn't ostracize me. She even helped me," Shermaine replied in shock before frowning. "Why are you here?" Trissy smiled and said, "I'm protecting you." Without waiting for Shermaine's answer, she said, "You seemed to be in a good mood when you came out." Shermaine recalled what had happened and bashfully said, "Maybe, perhaps, I have a chance of becoming a mother." As she spoke, she touched her stomach with her right hand, the corner of her lips couldn't help but curl. "I feel him kicking me." Shermaine suddenly froze and blurted, "How could it be so fast?" She wasn't sure if she could get pregnant today. Upon seeing her reaction, Trissy smiled even more charmingly. Chapter 10:19 Patience, how was it? Did you take a good look? Just as Furs left the street where Viscount Stratford's mansion was, she saw Zio walk out with a down and vacant expression. Zio nodded hesitantly. "I did." Having said that, she seemed to come to her senses and said in shock, "I know her." "No, him." "Him?" Furs was confused. Zio habitually observed her surroundings before saying, "He's Sherman. The Sherman I told you about." He actually became a woman. Furs was stunned as she subconsciously asked, "Were you mistaken? Could she be Sherman's sister?" Zio firmly shook her head. "No, she admitted it herself and even told me not to disturb her. She wants to bid farewell to her past." "But, how did he become a woman?" Furs's eyes darted around as she suddenly recalled something. She said in thought, "It's not impossible either. There's a beyonder pathway that allows a man to become a woman at a certain stage." She recalled Miss Justice mentioning something similar during a free exchange session. Really?" Zio's widened as she asked in disbelief. "Yes." Furs had already recalled the exact conditions as she gave a rather confident answer. This, Zio was momentarily unable to accept it, but she couldn't find a rebuttal. All she could do was ask, "Which pathway is it?" Furs replied, "Demoness." It's the assassin pathway." "Demoness." Sherman actually became a demoness, Zio repeated to herself. Suddenly, her voice became louder. "Could it be that she's being taken advantage of? No, I must warn her." Just as she said that, Zio turned around and ran with great strides in an attempt to catch up with the rental carriage again. However, she couldn't find the target after attempting to pursue it for a few blocks. Sherman and the carriage seemed to have disappeared into thin air. Zio gradually slowed down and finally stopped. She looked at the bustling streets ahead of her with a complicated expression. Behind her, Furs passed through a few walls and finally caught up to her. "Gone," Zio whispered. Furs also cast her gaze forward and thoughtfully replied, "We were discovered." Without waiting for Zio to speak, she turned around and sighed. "Let's return and find another opportunity." Zio didn't take a step forward as she continued standing there. After a few seconds, she said under Furs's puzzled gaze, "Since they discovered a problem, will they speed up their plans ahead of time?" "It's possible. If they don't wish for their plans to be foiled, they might attempt one final strike tonight before we're prepared." Furs immediately agreed with Zio. "Let's return to Viscount Stratford's place and hide in a more concealed spot. We'll continue monitoring it." Zio immediately nodded and replied without any hesitation, "Okay." In the dock area, inside a warehouse with plenty of goods, Shermaine was sitting on a dirty wooden crate. Her hands were crossed behind her back as her body had thin but firm spider webs coiled around her. She appeared as though she was encased in a transparent cocoon, unable to make a single sound. "It's not a bad thing for you." Trissy stood in front of Shermaine with a pitch-black flame that resembled ink burning in her palm. "At the very least, you can determine if he really loves you or is lying to you." Shermaine was angry and afraid. She desperately used her whimpers to express her wish, but Trissy was unmoved. She turned her flame-wielding palm around and pressed it into Shermaine's stomach. The flames seemed to have intelligence as they scattered like flowing water. Following that, they penetrated her skin and flesh in an attempt to drill inside. Trissy's smooth, black hair flared up in defiance of the laws of nature. They were being pulled by invisible hands as they extended out in every direction. It stained the surrounding air with a peculiar smell. The strands of hair thickened as they scattered into distinct strands. Beneath them, dark beams of light surged, bringing about curses and words. They flowed rapidly, fusing into the pitch-black flames. Upon entering Shermaine's stomach, they quickly vanished. Shermaine's face twitched uncontrollably, but she didn't feel any pain. It was as though it was purely on reflex. She soon calmed down as she saw Trissy's figure turn faint and gradually turn transparent until it vanished. Charmaine's pupils widened as she struggled again, but she was unable to break free from her restraints. She tried again and again like a flood was rising, centimeter by centimeter, inside the silent warehouse. After an unknown period of time, the door to the warehouse opened with a thud and slammed into the two sides of the wall. A figure staggered in. It was the middle-aged Viscount Stratford. He didn't wear his white wig like he always did while outside. This revealed his rather high receding hairline and rather messy black hair. The latter was stuck together as though it had been drenched by a storm and was air-dried. But in the past few hours, the clouds were thin and the crimson moon high in the sky. It hadn't rained at all. Drops of sweat dripped down Viscount Stratford's rather cut facial contours as there were countless black threads flowing beneath his skin. His body was slightly hunched, and his facial muscles were somewhat twisted. His eyes were filled with pain and concern. He surveyed the area and was delighted when he found Charmaine. However, he turned anxious as he charged over without much confidence. When Charmaine saw him enter the warehouse, her face lit up as though it was covered in a halo. She then revealed a worried and fearful expression as she attempted to shake her head frantically. However, her neck was held firmly by the spider webs that prevented her movement. She reeled in anxiety, to the point of tears flowing out of her eyes, drop after drop, crystalline and frail. Just as Viscount Stratford was about to reach her, a loud bang suddenly rang out between the two. It was as though there was an invisible wall that separated him from Charmaine, one that couldn't be surpassed. If you wish to break the curse and take her away, you have to answer my question without hiding anything. At this moment, a figure quickly appeared in a corner of the warehouse. Her facial features were charming, forming together into an abnormally sweet look. She resembled the lover that every young lad would fantasize about in his youth. She was none other than Demoness Trissy. Without waiting for Viscount Stratford's response, she raised her right hand and conjured a pitch-black flame. Viscount Stratford's face, hands, neck, and exposed skin instantly turned transparent as they protruded with blood vessels. And in every blood vessel, there was a black flame silently burning as it flowed silently. The pain in Viscount Stratford's eyes immediately reached a peak, but it vanished the next moment. His expression turned extremely cold as a gibing look appeared in his eyes. It was as though the one being cursed wasn't him, but Trissy, who was a distance away. Trissy, who was in the corner of the warehouse, suddenly burst into black flames. Dense, countless spider webs appeared, but they couldn't be lit up. In the blink of an eye, Trissy was like Charmaine, being sealed inside a transparent cocoon. She couldn't move or escape. In a ventilation vent high above the warehouse, a figure appeared. It was a woman whose age wasn't obvious. She wore a simple and sacred white robe. She had black hair, blue eyes, looking sweet and beautiful, giving off an indescribable charm. Katerina Pell, Trissy seemed to expend all her strength before she shouted a name. At this moment, Viscount Stratford grabbed at his body, pulling out an illusory doll covered in thick black flames. He glanced at Charmaine and smiled at Trissy. When it comes to matters related to life, I would never be careless. After that fellow, Sykes, died, I knew that it would be my turn one day. Heh, since you're hunting me, it means there are obviously others who wish to hunt you. We're very patient, afraid of scaring you away. We did nothing and waited until today. Also, your gift was pretty good. Upon hearing Viscount Stratford's words, Charmaine, who was still struggling out of habit, instantly stopped moving. Her expression turned blank. Her eyes widened, but there wasn't any focus. The look in her eyes seemed to sink deeper and deeper. Love, Trissy suddenly laughed, seemingly mocking herself. She wasn't nervous at all. Mager manner. Night had fallen. After settling more than 20 guests and preparing the hunting trip the next day, Klein woke up not long after he fell asleep. His intuition had been triggered as a scene formed in his mind. Brigadier General Konas Kilgore, who was wearing a shirt and pants, had flown out of the guest room's window in secret. He landed outside in complete defiance of the laws of nature. I haven't even taken action. He came here for his own goals. With a thought, Klein controlled a cockroach outside and turned it into his marionette. He then used its eyes to observe the surroundings. Almost at the same time, Konas Kilgore appeared. After this demigod left Magar Manor, he immediately distorted the distance and quickly arrived by the bank of the Tussock River. He prepared himself to cross it. The cockroach watched quietly without any reaction. He's heading for the south bank of the Tussock River. What does he want to do? Does he have the preference of hunting in the suburbs so that he can attempt to conceal such actions? He also introduced Magar Manor to me for this reason. Klein lay in bed and seriously analyzed Konas's actions. After the Mi-9 demigod stepped onto the south bank of the Tussock River, Klein suddenly recalled a matter. Back when he escaped the underground ruins wherein Zangwill and company were, he appeared somewhere in the northwest of Backland. This was the south bank of the Tussock River, making it rather close to where Magar Manor was. Chapter 10:20 Means of a Demonis. As his thoughts raced, Klein suddenly switched positions with his valet, Anuni, who was in the opposite room. And under a grapevine 150 meters from the manor's main building, a slowly crawling centipede suddenly stiffened before it relaxed. Almost at the same time, its body vanished from its location. Dwayne Dante in his blue and white checkered pajamas had appeared. Klein had swapped places with his marionette again. He decided to use this method to secretly tail Konas Kilgore and figure out where he was going or what he was planning on doing. Although he could only move 150 meters a time, and it took 2 to 3 seconds in between moves due to the process of turning the target into a marionette, this was more concealed compared to flaming jump or teleport. It made it difficult for Konas Kilgore to detect him. After all, he was dealing with a demigod. Even in domains where one's spiritual intuition wasn't the best, a demigod wasn't to be underestimated. By the same logic, Klein didn't rely on creeping hunger to hide in the shadows. This was because it was relatively slow even though it concealed him rather well. It was impossible for him to catch up to the demigod. Under the dark night sky, from Magar Manor to the south bank of the Tussock River, the rats, snakes, spiders, fish that were active in that stretch of land stiffened up and turned sluggish. They were converted into marionettes one after another. With their help, Klein constantly moved without causing a stir. Soon, he arrived at the south bank of the Tussock River, and after catching up to Konas Kilgore, he maintained a distance of 1 kilometer. To a bizarro sorcerer, even if a marionette were to go beyond his range of control, it wouldn't immediately escape from its controlled state or die immediately. Without a bizarro sorcerer's consciousness as a catalyst, this process was rather slow and needed nearly 10 minutes. Therefore, Klein wasn't worried that he would lose Anuni, who was lying in bed, while he did his tailing. As long as he returned within 10 minutes, he could continue controlling his marionette. Silently, Klein followed Konas Kilgore as they went upstream. Passing through the dense forest, they climbed up a mountain beside the bank. At this moment, Konas Kilgore, who wasn't wearing a vest or coat, suddenly stopped. He checked his surroundings and widened the range of his search as though he was trying to claim his territory. Upon seeing this, Klein didn't dare stay any longer. He immediately switched places with his marionettes and retreated repeatedly, pulling away to a distance of nearly 3 kilometers from the deputy director of Mi-9. At this moment, he gave up control of the marionettes ahead of him. The death of a few bugs wouldn't incur any suspicion. This was all too common in the outskirts and in the forests. King of the Five Seas Nast can create a fighting environment that's favorable for him. Will Konas Kilgore, who's also a Black Emperor pathway demigod, have the ability to demarcate such a region? He can change, boost, and use certain rules and make whoever tails him expose themselves without being able to hide? It's very possible. Klein warily took out a gold coin he placed in his pajama pocket. He ran it through his fingers and flipped it. This time, he deliberately controlled his strength and didn't produce a flicking sound. The gold coin flew up in silence and landed in his palm. Without needing to look down, the gold coin's face was naturally reflected in his mind. It was heads. This meant that the anomaly ahead contained extreme danger. As expected of a demigod. Such abilities sure are enviable. However, do you think you can avoid my tailing? Klein scoffed inwardly and found an abnormally secluded spot and made himself turn into Gehrman Sparrow. Following that, he clasped his hands and pressed it to his mouth, whispering, "Blessed of the sea and spirit world, guardian of the Rörsted archipelago, ruler of the undersea creatures, master of tsunamis and storms, the great Calvetua." After praying, Klein immediately took 4 steps counterclockwise and arrived above the gray fog. He sat at the fool's seat and beckoned for the bone scepter with blue gems embedded at its tip. Then, with the help of his prayer, he utilized the sea god scepter's responding to believers and saw the area around Gehrman Sparrow. He then raised his field of view and took in the surrounding area. Using this as the origin, he expanded his vision to 5 nautical miles. This was the limit of what the sea god scepter could observe with the help of its believers. And this way, the area where Kona's Klein had designated, one that no object could escape his notice, appeared in Klein's vision. In the dock area, inside a warehouse with plenty of goods. Love, after Trissy chuckled, her figure grew faint as though she was bathed in the luster of a lake at night. In the blink of an eye, Trissy, who had been bound tightly with layers of silk by demoness of unaging Katerina Pell, turned into an illusory mirror. It was a full-body mirror taller than a person. Aqueous light shimmered within as a ghostly halo grew out of it as though it was a door leading to another world. At that moment, it didn't reflect the scene in front of it. Instead, it outlined a room. The room was dimly lit. The bed and furniture had been diced up into countless small pieces which were scattered everywhere. Only the central region was spick and span. Trissy stood there, wearing a dark black dress. Her hair cascaded down smoothly as it fluttered in the wind, accentuating her face's abnormal fairness. She looked like a female ghost as spoken in folk tales. She wasn't actually present and was using the illusory mirror to project her figure and strength remotely. It was as though everything was real. Therefore, she wasn't flustered at all when she was being controlled and hunted. Upon seeing this scene, Katerina Pell, who wore simple and holy white robes, didn't hesitate to let out a shriek. Invisible waves quickly spread out as her hair flared up, each strand clear and distinct. They were thick and dyed with a grayish-white color. The illusory full-body mirror suddenly vibrated and shook as though it was on the brink of breaking apart. And in the messy room it reflected, the fragments of the bed, desk, and chairs turned grayish-white, losing their luster as though they were rocks. The brownish-yellow floor in front of Trissy turned into grayish-white rocks as it quickly extended towards the only human in the room like a surging tidal wave. Trissy didn't attempt to resist as she turned around and waved her hand back while leaping towards the open window. In midair, invisible spider webs that belonged to her phased into existence. They turned dark as they spread towards the grayish-white colors. At the same time, the dark and profound full-body mirror produced one crack after another. Amidst illusory shattering sounds, it broke apart and vanished. However, before the full-body mirror completely vanished, the grayish-white colors receded in a strange manner inside the petrified room, materializing into a figure. The figure wore a simple, holy white robe and had luscious raven-black hair. She looked both mature and innocent, as though she had a pair of profound and childlike blue eyes. She was demoness of unaging Katerina who had just been inside the warehouse a moment ago. Viscount Stratford could no longer see the situation inside the opposite room once the ghostly glow dissipated. He retracted his gaze and cast it onto Charmaine. He wore a mixed look in his eyes before he recovered. Trissy really was patient. To deal with me, she actually spent months to nurture a new demoness. Viscount Stratford shook his head with a chuckle. What did she want you to gain from me? At that moment, with Trissy's connection being severed, the spider webs around Charmaine had loosened. They were unable to bind her and restrict her freedom. This beautiful girl wore a blank expression as she replied with a vacant look in her eyes. She wanted me to know who you are truly loyal to. Without waiting for Viscount Stratford to say a word, she asked hesitantly, her eyes making it obvious that she had difficulty finding the words, how many of those promises that you made to me were real? Viscount Stratford was taken aback before he chuckled. You're probably the most silly and most naive demoness I've ever met. Charmaine's expression froze on her face as the glimmer in her eyes that she found so hard to regain faded bit by bit. Outside the warehouse, Xiao and Furs were hiding in the shadows, observing the silent target area. They had followed Viscount Stratford here. Their patience had paid off, as they discovered this captain of the royal guards secretly leaving his mansion in the dead of the night, rushing to the dock area near the Backland Bridge. Using Xiao's power as a sheriff, they followed him all the way here by keeping a huge distance between them. They had also confirmed that he had entered the warehouse in front of them. In addition, they also sensed that Viscount Stratford's condition had worsened as though he had been injured. Actually, we had the opportunity to take action while on our way here. Furs looked at the warehouse's entrance and murmured. Xiao replied without looking at her, but you said it yourself that you have a nagging feeling that things aren't that simple and wanted to wait. This might be the intuition of an astrologer. It might also be an act of procrastination, Furs replied in a self-deprecating manner. They didn't say anything more as silence ruled once more. They continued waiting patiently. At this moment, a pitch-black flame was ignited on the rammed earth in front of them. The strange flames rapidly dispersed and kept close to the ground as it swept away. It then outlined a row of Loanese text, "This is the chance you've been longing for." Xiao's and Furz's pupils dilated at the same time. Then, they looked at each other, at a loss for words. After a few seconds, Furs finally couldn't help but ask, "What do we do?" Chapter 10:21 Xiao hesitated when she heard Furz's question. We were discovered, they had said something similar before, but they were repeating it again now. However, it didn't have the same meaning. Previously, it was referring to being discovered by the guardian or monitor when she recognized Sherman. Now, the crux of the matter was that their choice and corresponding actions were expected and arranged by the person behind the scenes. They had no secrets to speak of. This meant that the chance that Xiao had been longing for might have really appeared, but what lay behind this matter was inconceivable. If we follow the intention behind this message, the final outcome will depend on whether she has good intentions, but that's not something under our control, Xiao added from a rational angle. The reason why she had used "she" to represent the person behind the scenes was because she had recalled the fragrance she smelled when she lost Sherman the other time. Furs listened quietly and nodded in agreement. Yes, we're too passive in this matter. The best option is to leave this place. As soon as she finished speaking, she looked at the warehouse. She opened her mouth but didn't say anything further. She was reminded of the possible situation Sherman was in, and she suspected that he was in grave danger. However, she deliberately ignored it in the end and didn't mention it. To her, Sherman was a person who existed in Xiao's descriptions. He was no different from a character in a novel. If she had the strength and opportunity to save him in passing, she was willing to do so, but to bear the risk because of that and allow her friend to be rash, putting her life in danger was definitely not something within her considerations. Xiao nodded and said, "All right, we'll leave now." However, the person who left that comment definitely wouldn't be happy to see us do so. She will definitely hinder us. Let's do it this way. We'll escape in different directions and make that person choose one person. Whoever successfully leaves this area will immediately cause a commotion and attract the official Beyonders. Why don't we directly cause a commotion here? Furs subconsciously raised a question. It will definitely be stopped or foiled. Xiao gave her excuse. Furs nodded thoughtfully. Makes sense. Alright, let's not delay it any further. Let's begin. Xiao didn't say another word as she took out her transparent, nearly invisible triangular blade. With her back bent, she leaped out of her hiding spot and ran out of the harbor amidst the shadows. The triangular blade was a mystical item she had spent 500 pounds through Mam Hermit to get the artisan to forge with the ancient wraith's powder and remnant spirituality. It was called Wintry Blade. Anyone hit by this weapon, even if it were a gentle touch, would be frozen stiff. They would even lose control of their thoughts as though they were possessed by a wraith. At the same time, once the battle continued, Wintry Blade's enemies would gradually have their thoughts turn sluggish and their actions become rigid and dull, even if they didn't touch the triangular blade. And Wintry Blade's negative effects wasn't that terrifying. Furthermore, there was only one: the wielder would slowly lose their body temperature and transform into an undead. Once a certain time limit was exceeded, this process would become irreversible. Therefore, Xiao had recently enjoyed jogging more or riding a bicycle at lightning speeds to generate heat to resist the loss of temperature. But even so, she had only managed to extend the time it took before she kept Wintry Blade away from her body from 3 hours to 4 hours. After running a certain distance, Xiao turned back and realized that Furs had already passed through a wall and departed. She had vanished from where they were hiding. After staring for 2 seconds, Xiao bit her lip and suddenly turned around and changed direction. She headed straight for the warehouse. Soon, she arrived beside her destination, but she wasn't in a rush to enter. She looked up and observed the area above her, seemingly trying to find another passageway, one that was less noticeable to the people inside. At that moment, her keen senses made her turn her head and see a figure appear around the corner of the wall. The figure wore a black dress with a head of brown, curly hair. She had a pair of light blue eyes. It was none other than Furs Wall. Didn't you leave? Despite being surprised, Xiao didn't forget to lower her voice. Furs curled her lips and said, "Weren't you fleeing too?" Xiao was momentarily at a loss for words. After a few seconds, she asked, "How did you notice it? You didn't even mention Sherman. That's completely unlike you. I've already prepared a reason to persuade you." Furs quickly replied. Xiao was taken aback as she said with a complicated expression, "You didn't have to come back." Furs ignored her and pressed on the wall of the warehouse and said, "If we keep talking, perhaps we will no longer need to be stumped because it would already be over." "Man, I actually didn't think of such a good idea just now. I should have immediately insisted on going with you to save her. You definitely would have persuaded me otherwise and would think of doing it yourself. If we repeated the conversation a few times, everything would have ended on its own." Xiao gave her friend a look and, without any hesitation, stood by her side with Wintry Blade in hand. Furs immediately flipped Lamino's travels and augmented her friend with Beyonder powers. Then, she put away the spellbook and grabbed Xiao's shoulder with one hand, pressing the other on the wall again. While Xiao was waiting for door opening, she realized that Furs hadn't immediately used her powers. This best-selling author took a deep breath and quickly said, after entering, "We'll hide and observe. After confirming that there's a chance to do something, we'll take action. If there's really no chance, or if we can't seize an opportunity for sure, we'll leave as soon as possible. That way, we can at least avenge Sherman and not be buried alive with him. Only by being alive will all kinds of possibilities open up for us." Xiao immediately nodded and replied in a stern manner, "Okay." Furs wanted to say a few more words, but considering how she had wasted some time and couldn't afford to waste any more time, she opened the illusory door and passed through the wall with Xiao, coming behind a row of wooden crates. With her no longer being a greenhorn in such operations, she instinctively crouched down and pulled out Layman's Travels and flipped to a particular page. Xiao similarly didn't dash in. She bent down and moved her eyes to a gap between the crates and observed the empty region. The female-looking Sherman was sitting on a wooden crate without any signs of anger. Her brown hair was gently fluttering in the wind. And standing in front of her was Viscount Stratford. This captain of the Royal Guards tightened his collar and was surveying the area, a mystery as to what he was looking for. "Unfortunately, you're only a demoness. Don't worry. I will let you die without any pain. You will be completely purified." As he spoke, he took out an item from his inner pocket. Xiao used her enhanced vision from the interrogator potion, and she clearly identified the item. It was a cross accessory covered in bronze. There were a few sharp, jagged protrusions, looking as though it had once impaled someone. Its style and characteristics were things that the various nations in the Fifth Epoch's northern continent didn't possess. It exuded ancient vibes. "Very good. You know that resistance is futile," Viscount Stratford said as he pressed one of the fingers he used to hold the bronze cross onto the spike. His bright red blood immediately flowed out and was absorbed by the spike, seeping into the object. The mottled bronze on the cross's surface disintegrated, revealing a corporeal form beneath that was a blob of light. In just a second or two, the item Viscount Stratford held had turned into a resplendent cross. It emitted a pure and flawless glow, illuminating the surroundings in an abnormally bright manner. The wooden crate's shadows quickly receded as the dark splotches on the wall evaporated like water. Beside Charmaine, the countless spider webs that originally belonged to Trissy floated up and struggled in the fire, melting in just mere seconds. The light grew brighter, but they weren't blinding. Black flames burst out of Charmaine's body along with crystalline ice. They turned dim, transparent, and eventually vanished under the illumination. Within the range of the resplendent cross, there weren't any traces of evil or abnormalities present. Not 1 inch of darkness remained. Seeing Sherman's expression slowly distort, Xiao couldn't help but shoot Furs a glance. She could clearly sense the terror of the resplendent cross, and she was beginning to waver about saving her. Furs also noticed what was happening and pointed to Layman's Travels. She raised her left index finger and whispered into Xiao's ear, "There's only one chance. I will work hard to create it for you. If it's not successful, or if you can't be certain of it, we will give up." Xiao didn't hesitate as she nodded solemnly. Furs immediately straightened her body and flipped Layman's Travels to the charred yellow page. This page was filled with complicated, twisted, indescribable symbols and labels. It gave one the feeling of a strong gust of wind. Sailor Pathway's demigod power, hurricane. After observing her surroundings once again and confirming that there weren't any other enemies, Furs's gaze penetrated through the gap in between the wooden crates and locked onto Viscount Stratford. She then slid her finger gently across the charred yellow page. With an exploding whoosh, a visible hurricane soared up beneath Viscount Stratford's feet and rushed upwards. The captain of the Royal Guards wasn't able to maintain his balance from this sudden attack. He was lifted up by the hurricane and was slammed into the warehouse's ceiling. Boom! The warehouse's ceiling was torn apart by the hurricane as portions of it collapsed. Some of the fragments spun around amidst the wind as they flew higher and higher. Viscount Stratford nearly fainted from being slammed, and he failed to hold onto the resplendent cross, allowing it to fly out of his palm. When the spike with a sliver of his blood left his finger, the mottled bronze covered the cross's surface once more. The flawless light vanished in turn. Upon seeing this, Xiao didn't hesitate to rush out of her hiding spot. Her eyes first reflected Viscount Stratford's figure before 2 blinding bolts of lightning lit up. Psychic piercing. Answer. Amidst the violent hurricane, Viscount Stratford was like a helpless leaf that was pitifully thrown about as though he could be torn to pieces at any moment. In this state, he couldn't react at all, much less speak. All he could do was rely on a disciplinary paladin's powerful body to barely hold on, hoping that he wouldn't lose a limb or head inside this terrifying hurricane. He originally believed that the hunt had succeeded and that Trissy's capture was at hand. Furthermore, he was extremely certain that his target didn't have helpers, hence, all his attention was focused on Charmaine. To his surprise, he suddenly became the prey and fell into a trap without any prior warning. Upon realizing that the hurricane was beginning to weaken and that he had only suffered some damage from the impact and didn't receive any fatal wounds, Viscount Stratford hurriedly tried to regain control of his body in preparation for the upcoming battle. At that moment, he felt a stabbing pain in his head which felt as though a sharp dagger had been impaled into it before being twisted a few times. This feeling was something that Viscount Stratford felt was both familiar and unfamiliar. This was because, although he had never experienced it directly before, he had attempted it on several targets to observe their reactions. This was one of the Beyonder powers he was most proficient with. Psychic piercing. Bang! Upon being attacked, Viscount Stratford, who had failed to adjust his physical state, slammed into the ground hard as the bronze cross loudly fell several meters away. Tap! 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 Zio held wintry blade and took a huge stride, dashing straight for Viscount Stratford who was struggling to get up. As for Furs, she had already flipped through Lamino's travels and flipped it open to a page that resembled a goatskin parchment. As her fingers slid across the page, Viscount Stratford's shadows, which had surfaced once again, came to life, condensing into black chains that wrapped around its target, binding him tightly. Viscount Stratford, who had just managed to catch his breath and become alert, still hadn't had the opportunity to choose the target for his punishment and apply certain restrictions when he once again lost his freedom. Even his mouth was bound by a shadow chain. Abyss chains. It was abyss chains from the Sanguine or Moon Pathway's mid-sequence Beyonders. Furs had used it once and was rather fond of this Beyonder power. She found it very useful, so she had spent gold pounds to get Mr. Moon, who had become a Viscount, to record it. Bang! At this moment, Viscount Stratford suddenly unleashed power that surpassed his previous strength, tearing the shadow chains apart. He had chosen the bindings, restricting him to be the target of punishment. But at that moment, Zio had already rushed in front of him like a high-speed train, thrusting that transparent triangular blade. Amidst a splotching sound, the wintry blade stabbed into the target's abdomen. Viscount Stratford's body stiffened once again as his eyes glazed over as though he had turned into an ice sculpture. Zio released her hand and allowed wintry blade to remain stabbed into the stomach of the captain of the Royal Guards, seemingly hoping that the wraith which might have existed on the weapon would continue possessing her target and forcibly bring him under control. Right on the heels of that, she swung her arm and slammed a punch right below Viscount Stratford's ear. After 2 heavy blows, Viscount Stratford fainted without even letting out a grunt. His stiff body collapsed once again. After completing this strike, Zio left her back to Furs and immediately moved past the staggering Viscount Stratford, who had wintry blade in his stomach, and dashed to Sherman who remained sitting on a wooden crate. Furs flipped through Lamino's travels once again, using other Beyonder powers to add another layer of restrictions onto Viscount Stratford's body. Then, she walked out of the row of wooden crates she had been hiding behind and first approached that bronze ancient cross. The scene she saw made her suspect that it was an item at the demigod level. In the parlance of official Beyonders, it was a Grade 1 sealed artifact. And with Viscount Stratford carrying and using it, she believed that the negative effects of the cross weren't that direct. She could attempt to pick it up. Of course, as a former astrologer, Furs took out the pure crystal ball as she walked, quickly doing a divination. There are no problems. Furs glanced at the outcome and quickened her pace. At this moment, Zio had already rushed in front of Sherman. Looking at this friend who had turned rather beautiful, she was momentarily at a loss for words. To her, Sherman's condition was in a terrible state. This demoness hair was floating up with each strand turning thick as if they were tiny snakes. On the ends of the tiny snakes, some had eyes or mouths. They appeared extremely bizarre and terrifying. On Sherman's face, a black paint-like mysterious pattern suffused out of her skin and was rapidly spreading across her body. Her slightly vacant eyes quickly reflected Zio as she gradually recovered her spirit and, along with that, also came a little confusion and pain. She opened her mouth and stuttered, "Zio. I'm in so much pain." Zio's vision instantly blurred. Although she was still lacking in many of the details regarding the mysterious world's general knowledge, since the Tarot Club's discussion was just way over her head, and the information she got from MI9 was mostly about secret organizations, she still knew quite a bit about losing control. Among unaffiliated Beyonders, it was something that couldn't be avoided. Therefore, Zio knew that Sherman was beginning to lose control. It was irreversible, and the situation would only worsen. Sherman seemed to sense her state as she gasped for breath, revealing a weak smile. She said with difficulty, "Kill me. I've done too many unspeakable sins. I've also obtained what I've wanted." Zio's tears dripped down. Without hesitation, she flipped her hand, drawing her backup weapon, an ordinary revolver. She then placed the revolver at Sherman's forehead. Sherman smiled as a mesmerizing charm appeared in her eyes once again. "Call me. Call me Charmaine, Charmaine." Zio couldn't help but frown as tears brimmed in her eyes. Bang! 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 She repeatedly pulled the trigger and fired the bullets inside. Fresh flowers bloomed at once, red and beautiful. Furs pursed her lips unknowingly when she saw this. After 2 seconds, she let out a long sigh. She bent down and reached out for the bronze cross. Just as her fingers touched the item, it felt like she had touched fire. It was hot and scalding, hot enough to burn the soul. Furs instinctively retracted her hand, feeling alarmed and puzzled. She remembered that Viscount Stratford had never acted in such a manner before. As her thoughts raced, Furs glanced at Viscount Stratford and kicked the bronze cross towards the nearby Zio. "Give it a try. Also, we have to leave immediately. The commotion from earlier will definitely attract the official Beyonders. Also, who knows what the person who left the message will do." Zio, with her reddened eyes, didn't say a word. She bent down and picked up the bronze cross. She didn't feel any sense of discomfort the entire time. Furs didn't ask why as she walked to the stiff Viscount Stratford's body and warily looked around. After Zio put away the bronze cross, she picked up Charmaine's corpse and returned to Viscount Stratford's side. "That item is very precious. His status is also very important. We'll definitely be the targets of the royal family's pursuit efforts. We need to do some interference." Furs looked down at Viscount Stratford as she muttered to herself in thought. She quickly made a decision. She raised her hands, lowered her head, and began piously chanting Mr. Fool's honorific name. She didn't believe that them giving up the bronze cross would stop the royal family from pursuing them due to being perceived to have lower priority. Therefore, without any hesitation, she prayed to Mr. Fool for help. To her, sacrificing the item to Mr. Fool was better than staying there. Almost at the same time, she saw a holy angel with 12 pairs of fiery wings. A phantom projected out of the angel as it descended from the sky, wrapping her and Zio in layers of flaming wings. Once this was over, Furs was just about to say something when she felt her body quiver. She felt a particular sense of horror and evil permeate from the void. Her eyes focused as she didn't hesitate to crouch down, reaching out her hands and grabbing Zio and Viscount Stratford's calf. At the same time, the final dark green stone with burn marks on her bracelet emitted a blue and illusory light. In the blink of an eye, the bodies of Furs, Zio, Viscount Stratford, and Charmaine turned transparent as they vanished from the spot. In seconds, they left the docks area and appeared on the outskirts of St. George Borough. During this process, Furs had even used her Beyonder power as a scribe to record traveling. After observing her surroundings and confirming that there was no one around since they were in the forests, Furs released Zio and Viscount Stratford and straightened her body. With the blessings of Mr. Fool's angel, there shouldn't be much danger. The person who left the message won't be able to lock onto us. Furs heaved a sigh of relief before saying with a lingering sense of fear, the person who descended upon us towards the end was definitely a saint. Thankfully, we quickly escaped. Zio gently lowered Charmaine's corpse and said in thought, if the person who left the message was monitoring Charmaine, then she might have already found out where we live. We can't return there. Yes, we need to change our residence, Furs said with great experience. Then, she cast her gaze at the unconscious Viscount Stratford. You can interrogate him now. Make every second count. As she spoke, she handed Lamino's Travels to Zio and exhorted, there's telepathy on it and it's used with candlelight. Also, start with the simple and unimportant questions to lower his resistance. Zio received the spellbook with a solemn expression. However, her wrist trembled, unable to hold Lamino's Travels. Pa! The bronze notebook dropped onto the ground as Zio said with a frown, it's like fire. Furs had the same experience earlier, so after some thought, she said, throw that cross away and try again. Zio followed her suggestion and successfully picked up Lamino's Travels. It cannot be held with other mystical items, Furs said with a nod when she saw this. Zio didn't harp on this problem as she quickly prepared a lit candle. Then, she drew Wintry Blade and relieved Viscount Stratford from his stiff and dazed state. After the captain of the Royal Guards gradually awakened, she triggered the corresponding page in the notebook. Viscount Stratford instantly fell into confusion, and only the faint candlelight remained in his eyes. Why did Charmaine try to approach you? Zio asked the question she had just thought of. Viscount Stratford replied blankly, she was investigating who I'm loyal to. Zio was taken aback as she instinctively asked, who are you really loyal to? Viscount Stratford slowly said, His Majesty, of course. Chapter 1023 Mason Dear's Death His Majesty. Zio was a little confused and filled with confusion when she heard Viscount Stratford's reply. She found it inexplicable that Charmaine would deliberately approach this captain of the Royal Guards just to investigate where his loyalties lay. This didn't seem to be something of great importance or value. As for Viscount Stratford's answer, it was very normal and without any faults. Charmaine paid with her life for such an answer? Zio originally wished to press for the reason behind Charmaine's investigation of such a trivial matter, but she immediately realized that it might involve key intel too soon. It might cause Viscount Stratford, who hadn't entered the necessary state, to put up resistance. So she gradually held back her instinctive urge. She thought for a moment and asked, do you know Mason Dear? Yes, Viscount Stratford answered blankly. Zio Dericha continued asking rather simple and unimportant questions. Who is he? He's the former captain of the Royal Guards, Viscount Stratford answered simply without elaborating. At this moment, Furs didn't listen to the telepathy at such a superficial layer. She took out the pure crystal ball and placed it in Zio's pocket. After transferring her items, she bent down once again and carefully attempted to pick up the bronze cross. This time, amidst her trembling fingers, the soul-burning feeling didn't assault her. It allowed her to easily pick up the spiky item. As expected, this cross cannot coexist with other mystical items. I still have Moon Paper figurine and the remnant spirituality of the ancient wraiths, but it didn't react. This means that it can coexist with items that don't contain Beyonder characteristics, but won't resist spirituality and strength? If that's the case, will it also reject the Beyonder characteristic within my body? But it doesn't seem obvious. This is its other negative side effect, and it requires some time before it shows signs. Furs had a general idea about this ancient bronze cross. She then warily stored it away in a bag that contained all kinds of ritual materials. After doing this, Furs looked down at the silver bracelet on her wrist. She confirmed that it was completely empty and was without any accessories hanging from it. She had used up all 5 stones that allowed her to use teleport. However, Furs no longer felt as anxious as before. Although she believed that the full moon ravings would become clearer and more terrifying with the usage of each stone, she also knew that with Mr. Fool's help, this wasn't a problem. Over the past year, if not for her need to spend some time above the gray fog during every full moon or blood moon, she would have almost forgotten that she was suffering the torment from the full moon ravings. I hope that the curse will be lifted one day. After retracting her gaze from the dull silver bracelet, Furs couldn't help but sigh. She then sincerely thanked Mr. Fool in her heart. No matter what his real goal is, he has rescued me time and time again. It hasn't only been from the full moon ravings. This cross's level doesn't seem low. I wonder if Mr. Fool will be interested and is willing to accept my sacrifice. I didn't have any good items or news to repay him for his benevolence. I finally see an opportunity. This is a common spoil of war. I only own half of it. I wonder if Mr. Fool is willing to accept a sacrifice that I only have half the rights to. No, Xiao has also been rescued by Mr. Fool before. Perhaps it might please Mr. Fool. If he is satisfied, he might produce a few Beyonder powers and allow me to record them in Lamino's travels. No, Lamino's travels might not be able to record a deity's powers. It won't be able to withstand Mr. Fool's powers. The powers of the angels under him will do too. No, I can't be too greedy. I'll be satisfied if Mr. World can demonstrate some of his powers for me to record. Furza's thoughts wandered as she had expectations akin to a dream. This was the instinct of a best-selling author. As for why she didn't expect anything else other than the recording of Beyonder powers, it was because she realized today how important and terrifying Beyonder powers at the demigod level were. If Lamino's travels didn't have Hurricane recorded, she and Xiao might not have been able to capture Viscount Stratford. They might not even succeed in escaping. Even if she didn't include the Bronze Cross, Viscount Stratford himself was a rather powerful Beyonder. If he hadn't been injured by Hurricane in the beginning and left dizzy from the fall, their sneak attacks might not have reached this level of success. There was a high chance that they might suffer a counterattack. Of course, separating the resplendent cross from Viscount Stratford was key to the victory of this brief battle tonight. And again, this was all thanks to Hurricane. On careful thought, if we switched to a less pressing situation, and if the Bronze Cross and the demigod powers in the notebook were excluded, Xiao and I might have a chance of defeating Viscount Stratford together. We might even have quite good odds. The Beyonder powers recorded in the notebook are varied, and when put together, they're truly powerful. Together with Xiao's psychic piercing and the effects of Wintry Blade, in a head-on battle, it's reasonable for Viscount Stratford to be defeated if he doesn't have any special mystical items. A living scribe with rich experience is actually this powerful. The more Furs thought, the stranger she felt. She realized that she had become rather formidable. Back when they were dealing with the ancient wraith, she had already come to a similar conclusion. And this time, their enemy, Viscount Stratford, was the captain of the royal guards of the lone royal family. He was at least sequence 6 and was probably sequence 5. Furthermore, he wielded an item at the demigod level. The level of his strength was clear, so this immediately allowed Furs to benchmark her level in the world of Beyonders. Although their victory mainly stemmed from a sneak attack, a successful one was also a manifestation of one's strength. I'm already a scribe. With a good combination of powers, together with Lamino's travels, I'm already a rather strong sequence 5. The only problem is that I lack experience. As Furs reflected poignantly, she cast her gaze at Zio and Viscount Stratford, continuing to listen to their questions and answers. At this moment, Zio's question had already reached a rather key topic that could easily result in resistance. How did Mason Deer die? After asking this question, Zio's expression suddenly turned complicated and expectant. She was also in a dilemma, feeling pangs of excitement and fear. This was a question she wished to ask 8 years ago. In these nearly 3,000 days, she had been constantly searching for an answer, but she was also afraid that the answer wasn't something she expected. She was afraid that her father was really involved in a mutiny and thus was executed, marring his reputation. Viscount Stratford didn't immediately answer Zio's question. He seemed to struggle before saying, he discovered His Majesty's secret and tried informing the 3 churches but failed. He was executed on the spot. Zio fell into a daze for a few seconds before finally confirming the answer she received. Although this answer shocked her, it made the heart in her mouth sink back to its original position as she calmed down. Secret. His Majesty's secret, she muttered softly to herself and asked in a pressing tone, what secret? Furs, who was beside her, was also shocked to the point of being dumbfounded. She never expected things to develop to this stage. At that moment, Viscount Stratford's facial muscles visibly contorted. It took him a great deal of effort to say a few words. That secret is, suddenly, his body jerked violently. His confused eyes regained their luster. Right on the heels of that, his body collapsed from the most minute part, instantly transforming into a ball of fireworks. The blood-red fireworks soared into the sky and exploded, illuminating the night sky as they were reflected in Furz's and Zio's eyes. Having experienced this previously, Furs didn't waste any time after her eyes momentarily blanked out. She immediately crouched down and grabbed Charmaine's corpse and Zio's calf. Their figures swiftly turned transparent as they vanished from the spot, teleporting to the southern area of the bridge. Above the grey fog, Klein, who was holding the sea god scepter, saw the fireworks that stained the sky red. Back when Furs prayed to him, he had happened to be inside the magnificent palace observing Kona's Kilgore's actions. He conveniently took in the red priest card and used the paper figurine he cut, stirred the powers of the mysterious space, and gave a response. During this process, he discovered that the person lying next to Miss Magician and Miss Judgment was Viscount Stratford. This was one of the targets he had placed great importance on. Although he hadn't investigated him personally, he knew that there was something wrong with him. He knew that Demonis Trissi was targeting him, so he had remembered his appearance and characteristics at a ball. Klein didn't know what the 2 Tarot Club members were up to, but since it involved Viscount Stratford, he definitely didn't write off its importance. He directly observed what subsequently happened to Miss Magician and Miss Judgment through the crimson stars. After advancing to a demigod and obtaining even more authorities, he didn't need the Tarot Club members to pray to directly observe their vicinity via the crimson star. This was similar to specially marking out believers, but Klein had always held great restraint towards that and had never attempted it. This made him hear Zio's and Viscount Stratford's conversation. And since he knew the underlying truth, he knew very well what the true meaning and importance of who he was loyal to was. Combined with the discovery of the king's secret by the former captain of the Royal Guards, Mason Deer, and how his attempt to inform the 3 churches failed, Klein already had a guess. He suspected that the greatest culprit behind the great smog of Backlund was the Lone Kingdom's king, George III. (1024) Traditional skills inside the palace above the grey fog. Klein, who was holding the sea god scepter, looked at the Black Emperor card and the Tyrant card on the table in front of him with a heavy look. Although Viscount Stratford's answer could only prove that King George III hid a great secret, had played a crucial role in the great smog of Backlund, and was highly likely to be a mass murderer, it couldn't be said that he had spearheaded everything and was the true mastermind. After all, he might only be a puppet. But to Klein, this was already enough. The target was clear, and he had clues to investigate what they were planning. Seeing that Miss Magician and Miss Judgment had left the area where the abnormality had happened and were practically safe, Klein retracted his gaze and continued to observe the actions of MI9 Deputy Director, Konas Kilgore, via prayer vision. After a while, after securing the territory and confirming that no one was tailing him, Konas Kilgore walked to a mountain wall and took out an object. His entire body was tainted with a ghostly blue glow as he gradually became hazy and blurry. Then, he disappeared into thin air, his whereabouts unknown. A rather special form of traveling via a corporeal ritual or item that allows him to teleport from point to point within a very short distance. Back when I came out from the underground ruins where Zangwil was, I also passed through a similar door. Yes, this place isn't too far from the mountain where Mr. A pursued me. This setup needs a very suitable and secretive region. Without having any permission from the interior, just holding on to an activation item might not have any effect. And once something happens, destroying the corresponding ritual can prevent enemies from entering and stop them from finding the exact location. Klein nodded in enlightenment. Combining the information which Viscount Stratford had just revealed, he had come to the initial conclusion that the king's secret and the ploy by the three factions were all hidden deep within the underground ruins. As long as one entered, the truth would be obtained through a careful investigation. However, the difficulty in performing the investigations became apparent the more he thought about it. He had to first obtain the corresponding item and, using his disguise as a faceless to fool the guards, he would teleport in. None of these steps were easy. According to Rhodes, Konas Kilgore wasn't just a demigod of the Black Emperor pathway, he also possessed a rather powerful sealed artifact. Even if Klein had made preparations, his odds of defeating the Brigadier General of MI9 wasn't too high if he didn't seek the help of angels, much less finish him off in a stealthy manner without anyone realizing it. Furthermore, there were many difficulties in getting the help of an angel, as all of them had their own extenuating circumstances that prevented them from agreeing. Even if I take down Konas Kilgore without drawing the attention of anyone, I have to consider the danger that stems from entering. Based on what previously happened, it's impossible for them to not be on guard against a faceless, a cooperation effort between the king, the psychology alchemists, and the demonist sect guarantees that their ploy is significant. It's extremely possible that there's an angel within the underground ruins. Klein frowned as he was at a loss for a reliable angle for investigation. He tapped the edge of the long model table and decided to break out of the confines of his original thoughts and consider it from a different angle. A few seconds later, a flash of inspiration came to him. Why do I want to complete all these steps by myself? The king's secret and plans are likely detrimental to the three churches of Storm, Evernight, and Steam, otherwise, the former captain of the Royal Guards, Mason Deer, wouldn't have attempted to inform the three churches. As a blessed of the Evernight goddess, at least for now, isn't it obvious what I should be doing? This can also count towards my contributions to exchange for the scholar of your potion formula. In an instant, Klein's thoughts became extremely clear. He left the area above the gray fog without any hesitation and returned to the real world. Dressed in blue and white checkered pajamas, Gehrman Sparrow raised his hands once more and made a prayer gesture. He chanted in ancient Hermes, the Evernight goddess who stands higher than the cosmos and more eternal than eternity. You are also the Lady of Crimson, the Mother of Concealment, the Empress of Misfortune and Horror, Mistress of Repose and Silence. This time, Klein didn't hold a ritual because he wasn't praying for a bestowment or response. All he wanted was to simply describe what Viscount Stratford had said, as well as his observations regarding Konas Kilgore. Therefore, a direct prayer was sufficient. After praying, Klein exhaled and stood in a remote area of the woods, patiently awaiting the possible developments. In less than a minute, a figure suddenly appeared in front of him, like a quickly sketched portrait. The newcomer was dressed in a simple robe. By the figure's waist was a belt made of tree bark. Long hair cascaded down as the figure was barefoot. She had a pair of dark and serene eyes, and she was none other than the highest-ranking archbishop and leader of the ascetics, servant of concealment, Ariana. "Good evening, Ma'am Ariana," Klein bowed without any hint of surprise. Ariana glanced at him and returned the greeting. "Good evening." She didn't make any small talk as she directly asked, "Kona's Kilgore is nearby?" "Yes, less than 10 kilometers away." Klein pointed in the direction. "He has already used an item to vanish from his place. What should we do next?" Ariana nodded slightly and said, "Wait for him to come out and find an opportunity to capture him." Isn't that too direct? You look quiet and plain, a cultured person, no, Angel. Why are you so aggressive? If Kona's Kilgore didn't head for the underground ruins and had gone to some other secret base, or if he wasn't too deeply involved in the king's ploys, to have the church's archbishop taking action on MI9's top brass would definitely be breaking news. The kingdom's fracturing would only worsen. Klein was momentarily unsure how he should respond to Ariana. Although he would definitely attack Kona's Kilgore if he handled the matter himself, since the latter's involvement in the slave trade and the silencing of others was enough reason, the problem was that a demigod of a secret organization attacking a military top brass and an Orthodox church's archbishop attacking a military top brass was two completely different matters. As though sensing Klein's thoughts, Ariana calmly explained, "You will be the one taking action, not me." Klein was a little unused to her style. Ariana continued, "I will create a concealed world for you and provide you the necessary assistance." Battle in a concealed state? Fight with the help of an angel? Klein nodded with a thought. "Then where shall the ambush be?" Ariana answered succinctly, "In your mager manner, I share the same thoughts. But I didn't want to say it myself." Klein took a deep breath and exhaled. The choice for the ambush location stemmed from very simple logic. It was to do it when Kona's Kilgore was in his most relaxed and defenseless state. Without a doubt, once Kona's finishes his secret mission and returns to Mager Manor, he would believe that the most risky matters of the night were over. He wouldn't have his guard up. For the same reason, if the king's secret employ was of utmost importance, it was possible for an angel to be watching over him while he returned from the underground ruins. Once he suffered an attack, the angel would be able to immediately respond. And only when Kona's returned to his normal daily routine would the monitoring be retracted. After all, there were only a limited number of angels, so it was impossible for them to be so free. Thankfully, I used the most covert method of tailing him, and the distance was far enough. From the looks of it, Ma'am Ariana didn't place the responsibility of the battle onto me to avoid the risk and reduce the negative effects, but because maintaining a concealed state and preventing the existence inside the underground mints from noticing the battle will drain a great deal of her energy. Amidst his racing thoughts, Klein had a better idea of how he should proceed. At this moment, Ariana added, "The concealed world's battle won't damage the real world." "That's pretty good." Klein muttered silently and said after some thought, "Then I need to immediately make some preparations." "All right," Ariana calmly replied. She didn't even ask me what preparations I need. I was even prepared to say that I need a change of clothes. As Klein lampooned himself, he looked down at his blue and white checkered pajamas. His left palm quickly turned transparent as he vanished from the spot. Inside Mager Manor, Klein's figure blinked into existence. Maintaining his appearance as Gehrman Sparrow, he quickly changed his clothes and wore a top hat. Following that, he took out a piece of paper and used his finger to write. The tip of his finger spewed out a scarlet flame, leaving charred marks without burning the piece of paper. The charred marks quickly formed a complicated symbol that was a mixture of concealment and mystery prying. With the formation of this symbol, the full-body mirror in the room turned dark as aqueous light rippled. A silver outline appeared, forming one word after another: "Exalted Great Master, your loyal and resilient servant, Orodes, is here to answer your summoning. Do you have something you would like to ask me?" "Yes." Klein nodded and looked out the window. What demigod powers and powerful sealed artifacts does Kona's Kilgore have? This was something he vaguely knew before. After confirming that Kona's Kilgore was a target, he gathered more information and now wished to know more so as to prepare a strategy meant to target Kona's. The full-body mirror's silver words warped and squirmed, quickly forming new words. Great Master, Kona's Kilgore is an Earl of the Fallen. To hide his strength, he wields a sealed artifact that also belongs to the Lawyer Pathway. However, it also has some of the Arbiter Pathway's characteristics mixed into it. It's called Chapter 1025 Random Anomalies. The full-body mirror's silver words seemed to have a life of their own as they vanished and reformed. The concerto of light and shadow is a pocket watch. It can restrict certain actions in a particular area, and it can also strip certain beyonder powers from the target. When the two are put together, the limitations that are created far exceed the two types. The concerto of light and shadow is also able to gift certain negative side effects to the target, making him sluggish, eager, avaricious, or lose their fighting spirit, only capable of focusing his attention on money. Apart from these effects, the sealed artifact's wielder would have the ability to distort the target's speech, actions, intentions, and attacks. It can reduce a lethal blow into a serious injury, or it could repel an attack, turning progression into retrogression, escaping into leading a charge. The negative effects of Concerto of Light and Shadow are rather serious. Amongst them, the main negative effect to take note of is that once it's brought into combat, all the beyonder effects produced in a certain region would intermittently experience random anomalies. It wouldn't distinguish between friend or foe, making it hard to control and unpredictable. That also means that lightning strike might still create a bolt of lightning, but it might splash the target with a blast of cold water or summon unknown spirit world creatures. Due to this reason, Kona's Kilgore has deliberately sought out a mystical item that can make him sufficiently lucky at critical moments, hoping that the random intermittent effects will benefit himself. It's definitely useful to a certain extent, but it's not that great. Kona's Kilgore also has a strange revolver. It originated from an anomaly during an evil god's sacrifice. It's called Rever's Shout of Despair. It can shoot without bullets, and each shot possesses immense strength. It can shoot at a rapid pace like a miniature machine gun. Targets who are hit by it will suffer Rever's Shout of Despair before he died. They will suffer different levels of pain, dizziness, and confusion. The biggest problem with the revolver is that the wielder will also hear the shout of despair. It just won't be too frequent. As an Earl of the Fallen, Kona's Kilgore no doubt has a qualitative change when it comes to distortion and the unreasonable bestowment. In addition, he can also exploit laws and magnify effects, and use disorder to disrupt order. Exploit can extend certain states for longer periods of time or end it ahead of time. It will make the rules more beneficial to himself. For example, after jumping into midair, the state of being away from the ground can be extended, achieving the effect of floating. Magnify can boost the effects or influence of his actions. It can make an ordinary attack become an execution. It can turn a hug from a distance away into a restriction. Disorder will influence the structure of objects, the standards of measurement, and the accuracy of attacks. It will make a seemingly massive building collapse, causing what seems like a huge distance to be shortened to that of a few paces, as well as allowing attacks that are aimed at him to miss their mark. Through magnify, exploit, and distortion, beyonders of the Lawyer Pathway can achieve certain things that only beyonders of the Arbiter Pathway can accomplish. Of course, low and mid-sequence beyonder powers of the Lawyer Pathway like bribe are equally possessed by an Earl of the Fallen and are even stronger. Great Master, I've finished answering your question. Is that okay? Your answer is like a guidebook. You must have been gathering information from the spirit world while delivering it. Also, must you seek praise even for matters such as this? Klein lampooned and nodded slightly. That's right. After answering Rhodes's question, he quickly got into the zone as he analyzed the powers and traits of the powerful sealed artifact which the demigod, Konas Kilgore, had. An Earl of the Fallen is indeed a sequence for demigod existence. There are qualitative changes in various aspects. Be it bestowment, distortion, exploit, and magnify, none of them are easy to deal with. I might suffer if I'm careless. Rather, disorder isn't terrifying. It's basically an enhanced version of the sequence 5 Mentor of Confusion's power. The Concerto of Light and Shadow does have traits of the Arbiter domain. And the most frustrating aspect about it is the negative side effects. To a Beyonder of the Seer pathway, my combat style is definitely closer to one of preparation, precision, and control. Once the battle begins, the moves will chain one after another. During this process, if a random deviation were to happen, the entire plan can easily be messed up and not be accomplished. It's very dangerous. As he thought, Klein discovered that the main problem stemmed from the sealed artifact named Concerto of Light and Shadow. As a Beyonder who liked setting up traps for his enemy, Klein didn't wish that after throwing himself into a perilous situation through his painstaking planning and hard work, he would realize that the item would summon a rabbit just as he was using the Fate Siphon charm to switch fates with his target to turn the tables and finish off his opponent. Or perhaps it would turn into fireworks to celebrate the death of the user. Konas Kilgore can reduce the effects by raising his luck, but I can't do it. Fortune or misfortune that's not at the angel level won't be effective on me. However, I have the marionette, Winner Anuni. Klein thought as he gave Rhodes the second question, how can the intermittent random anomalies of that sealed artifact be avoided? Silver words appeared out of the ripples of the deep mirror, forming a new sentence, there's no need to avoid it. Konas Kilgore just needs to become unlucky, and for this, the demigods of the Evernight pathway are experts. Makes sense. According to the theory of relativity, as long as Konas Kilgore is more unlucky than me, I'll be the lucky one. Ma'am Ariana said that she can provide me with assistance. To her, secretly slipping some misfortune onto Konas Kilgore before creating the concealed state should be very simple and easy. Klein immediately nodded cheerfully. Very good. That's it for today. I'll summon you again if there's anything else. Yes, Master. No problem, Master. Goodbye, Master. On the full-body mirror's surface was a simple drawing followed by silver words. Seeing the mirror instantly return to normal, Klein retracted his gaze and quickly simulated the battle that would happen in his mind. Gradually, he came up with an idea, and grabbing onto that flash of inspiration, he proceeded forward in refining it. After having a few tentative plans, Klein walked to the balcony and looked at the garden and the night sky, whispering, "Can you inflict misfortune onto Konas Kilgore before the battle?" After a brief silence, a calm and ordinary female voice rang in his ears, "Yes." "Then it's fine on my side," Klein immediately replied. Tranquility quickly returned to his surroundings. A rather cold breeze blew by, and Klein expressionlessly stared at the manor for a few seconds. Then, he pressed down on his silk hat, pulled the human-skinned glove on his left hand, and drew Death Knell from his underarm holster. Right on the heels of that, he flicked his thumb and made the iron-black revolver's cylinder spin. The night grew darker as the crimson moon occasionally tore through the clouds. Mager Manor was completely in a state of deep sleep. At this moment, a figure stealthily came from the Tussock River's south bank, taking 2 to 3 steps to return to his room. He was none other than the deputy director of MI9, Konas Kilgore, who wore a white shirt and black trousers. This demigod with a stout look surveyed the area and didn't notice any abnormalities. He gradually revealed a smile and walked to the bar counter in the guest room. Getting a cup, he picked up a bottle of Mager red wine. He prepared to pour some for himself to celebrate the wonderful night. At this moment, his spiritual perception was triggered as he looked up abruptly. He saw the buildings with a few grayish-white chimneys suddenly become covered in shadows as if they were dyed with ink. To the side of the chimneys, on one of the steeple landmarks of Mager Manor's main building, it was equally dark. The bright red moon was silently hanging behind the chimney. The clouds and stars high in the sky had vanished. Apart from the gigantic crimson moon, there was pitch-black darkness. Under the night sky, the flowers and trees were clearly in front of him, but they lacked any signs of life. They were dim, as though they were a great distance away. Black and red, shadows and buildings, and the silence and plants presented themselves in front of Kona's Kilgore in such a strange state. This. The demigod's pupils dilated as he didn't hesitate to respond. He reached his left hand into his clothes and extended his right hand under his armpit, taking out 2 items. Amongst them, he held a strange revolver in his right palm. It was entirely gray in color, bigger than an ordinary revolver. It looked like it was half the size of a sledgehammer that was used in classical battles. Another unusual trait of the revolver was that it had 6 barrels, each rather thick. The mouth was dark, and its cylinder was embedded with more than 10 ugly rivets, making it have a rather crude beauty. Kona's Kilgore's left hand held an iron-skinned pocket watch. On the watch's face, half of it was filled with neatly arranged symbols that followed the order of time, while the other half was a chaotic mess. It even intruded into the neighboring region. On both sides, it seemed impossible to see the machinery behind them as they formed into a structure that looked even more complex and headache-inducing. Almost at the same time, a figure emerged out of the gigantic crimson moon. It glided over at an extremely fast speed. He grew bigger and clearer. He was a young man with black hair, brown eyes, and cut features. The young man was wearing a silk top hat and a black trench coat. He held a unique revolver in one hand, and a transparent human-skinned glove covering the other. Under the bright illumination of the surroundings, he seemed to be burdened with the weight of the gigantic crimson moon. Gehrman Sparrow. Miao had an only slightly assisted fight against a sequence 4, where planning might go awry. I am looking forward to seeing how he will pull this off. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.